Good afternoon to all, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be accompanying this panel in our third block of this experience exchange of women and drug trafficking, which the Ministry of Justice and Law has called us, and UNODC as well. Since I would like to make a brief dialogue on the topic that we're here for, since we have had a lot of advance thanks to all the struggle that the feminist groups have carried out. There's still some gaps of these inequalities of Judeo-Christian and patriarchal one that we have been oppressed for so many centuries. If in these historical loads we add poverty and then the consumption, this becomes a painful and social suffering cocktail, which we are seeing and is being seen in different ways in our day-to-day life, and these women who are consumers in a more brutal way, and these non-consumers who are poor also in some ways that have some critical effects. So those women that are consumers, the violence of gender violence is increased among them because there's a reason they are consumers and they make them more dependent. And if we're dependent and we have our partners who are also dependent, they have history of family violence, this puts us in a situation that we are addicted to this, and some of our colleagues are going to be speaking about this in their presentation. Another aspect that we have in our job with the vulnerable civil society, we speak with young vulnerable people. This idea that we are a little bit of witches and hysterical, that is a social representation that makes this for the consequences of all this violence, the anxiety of because of tiredness, because we work double shifts, that is being manifested and has been scarred, sometimes attended with pharmacos, with medicine, and with incoherent times, with ways that sometimes wouldn't allow us to have relief processes. And the other thing is the violence in the that system practices on young women. Those that I'm working with right now, when they're a consumer of cannabis and they get pregnant, here there is a whole bribery thing of manipulation, of guilt, and of lack of information. Some women do not know their rights. So here we have the substitutions that are in charge of these children. They criminalize these mothers, they punish them, they chase them. There is some immense territory in that we have to carry out work in this public policy to for treatment, as we have heard in some interventions. This is a punitive treatment, and in the education side, there's an exclusion that is quite large, and there is something that we can say that there's perspective education of purely of where they consider their children. If I have two children, I would like to study. If the system does not have this perspective, it is very difficult for me to achieve this process and for me to graduate. So in the problem with work access, the consumption makes women in the exploitation of general maintenance services, and the way they have to go out and work in an informal way where they're risking themselves, and where prostitution becomes one of those doors. So the last thing is the thing with justice. I would like to read a paragraph of a crime that says women who are in jail for drug trafficking crimes, they share a similar profile: young, poor, mothers that are single, and they're heads of their home households with low education, responsible for the care of their children and other members of the family, and frequently of all these vulnerable sectors that have been excluded. Women who have been imprisoned for drug-related crimes are mainly there because of non-violent crimes, misdemeanors like transportation of or drug trafficking. These vulnerabilities that I spoke about sum up here. So what work opportunities do many of these women have, like taking the packages, doing this favor. And here is where we find this context that requires a overview on public policies and for them to be changed, to change the situation. For this reason, we have three guests who are accompanying us today and who are going to show us from the different profiles. They're going to speak to us from different profiles and different experiences on this specific topic of the perpetrators. And we're going to be speaking about these aspects. The first speaker is Eva Juliet Gonzalez. She belongs to the community of Life and Path Walkway and makes part of the Integración Social, Social and Comprehensive Department in Bogota. She joined this with the conviction of a life change for the cooperative of ex-homeless people or street people who live out on the streets, who is working in the favor of those women whose rights have been breached, especially for those that are in the streets. This offers them an comprehensive treatment for these people who are homeless that are beyond 29 years of age. Their purpose is to contribute to the personal development of each one of these participants through processes that can foster the social occupational side and the support networks. These actions would allow these people to leave this street life and contribute to their life projects, so their life projects can be sustainable and they can be aimed at social inclusion. Our other guest is Dr. Susan Whitley from the Social Work School in the South California University. She's a dean and professor of the Research Institute Roga Peck. I'm not really sure about the pronunciation of the Southern California University in the United States. She has a bachelor in technology in Texas, Austin, and the University of Austin, Texas. And the idea in the United States, she has centered her research for more than 2 decades on the comprehension and treatment of health and welfare of those women and men who have been marginalized from the civil society, especially those who are in the situation of homeless. She has seen the abuse and the perpetration of the mental health and physical health in the social context, communitary context of housing and services. Dr. Wesley has been chosen a member of the American Academia on Social and Social Welfare and the Psychological Economy and the Western Psychology. She has made part of study sections for National Institutes of Health and other scientific and health organizations from the United States and international ones as well. She has been a consultant for the National Public Policies that have been cited by the White House, and she has also made part of the practical communities of the educational development and medical research centers in Medical College. And she's a social member of the Women Without a Home in Europe. And last but not least, our guest from the University of Malta, Marilyn Clark. She is a social professor from the Department of Psychology from the University of Malta. During 20 years, she has taught and has done research in the Department of Studies on Youth and Community. She formed herself in social psychology at the University of Liverpool, and she has a PhD from Sheffield University. Her main research interests are oriented on the violence against journalists. She has published broadly in several edited and magazines that have been revised by experts. Apart from her commitments with the university, Professor Clark has partaken in local activities and also international ones in her specialization areas. In Malta, she makes part of the Administration Council of the Malta and she's also made part of members of the National Consultative Agency for this addiction, and she makes part right now of the psychologist chamber of Malta. And with this presentation, now we can see that we have people with a lot of voices and different angles, and I would like to invite Eva Juliet, our colleague from Colombia, from Camino, so she can carry out her presentation. If you wish to turn on your cam, yes, now I can see. Okay, Eva, you can go ahead. Good afternoon. First of all, my name is Eva Julia Gonzalez. I am 42 years old. I am head of the house. I have 4 boys. I have a beautiful granddaughter that's 3 years of age. The name of my presentation is Seeking Heaven After Going Through Hell. My story begins like this. I come from a middle-class family with values and principles. I did my basic primary school. I graduated with honors, but when I was 13 years of age, I was an orphan of mother. I lost my mom. It was devastating. I cannot surpass this moment. 2 months before my mother's death, the cleansing of social life took my brother's life away, the youngest of the boys. My family is formed of 5 brothers, 3 boys, 2 girls. After 14 months without my mom, the destiny takes away the most valuable thing that I had in the first stage of my life, my father. This was very painful for me. For this moment, I was 14 years of age and I was studying 8th grade in a feminine school in the city of Bogota. I felt that my life was a disgrace. I was living in my grandparents' house from my father's side with my aunts, their husbands, their cousins. I was very happy despite I didn't have my parents. Each step I take and every place that I will go to, it would remind me of them because I would not tell my cousins things so my children would not find out. I ended up committing myself to things that at this age I could not do or was not so clear for me. My aunts decided that I must go live with a brother to the other extreme of the other side of the city, and here is where everything began. Everything that I'm about to tell you. My brother used to live with his wife and his 2 beautiful children. My niece that was 3 years old and my nephew that was 4 months old. They decided that I should not study anymore, that I must validate all this on Saturdays and Sundays for 2 hours for like a GED, and then I would take care of my nephews. They changed my books, my notebooks for diapers. So they will go to work and I will stay home caring for these children. No one asked me how I felt about this. It was just receiving orders, naggings, and humiliations at all time. I used to always get into my isolation comfortability zone, and they did not imagine what was happening with my. On Saturdays, my sister-in-law would arrive from work, and we would go to her family house. They would begin to drink, and me as well. I would be taking care of my nephews and nieces. My brother would travel a lot because of work, and he did not know of all the humiliations that I was going through in behalf of my sister-in-law. After 1 year, my sister-in-law found a spot for a kindergarten for my nephew, and my responsibility was to take the children to this kindergarten, and my children would stay at school. The rest of the time, I was free. Every day, I would be free to 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I was supposed to pick up the children. I would always spend time with my sister-in-law's nephew, is the person that was supposed to take care of me, respect me, and make me be respectable. He did not know about any principles or values. He began to attack me physically. His companionship was something that was nice, but all those demonstrations of affect that he was showing me, all he was looking for was the great prize or great award, my virginity. After some days, I started making friends around the neighborhood. These were boys that were criminals and that were consumers of cannabis. I will go to them, I will hang out with them, and I thought it was quite relaxing to interact with them. They were people who were opposed. I mean, they would break laws or rules, and I would not dare myself to cross any limits. for this moment. These children would spend money on us. For them, it was a privilege to have girls like I and for them to hang out with me. So they would call us gomelas because the way we would dress and speak. It was incredible the way they would reveal themselves on the things that were happening in the country and the economic crisis of the country. And for those days, I was already trying out marijuana. One or two pulls, I would see how they would smoke a whole joint completely, and their reds would get red, and their view or their sight would be confusing. I would not smoke a lot because I would think that they would see me in my house, and I didn't want that. I started arriving after 6 o'clock, and my sister-in-law would tell my brother. My brother would hurt me and would mistreat me, but I would continue working it, and I began to have sexual relationships with my sister-in-law's nephew. I was not center on what was happening, and I was pregnant. After some months, I never told anybody, and I started consuming marijuana on an everyday basis at all times. I wanted to escape this routinary days and continue on my own. But then I was sure of one thing, that whatever would happen, I will have my child at an early age, and I will continue with my consumption. I had my first child when I was 16 years of age, and I was living with his father. He was a year older than I was. He was quite responsible, but he was quite jealous and possessive. I was just a girl that was very attractive, and that will make me feel insecure. And he took him to mistreat me in a physical way. He said that it was better for him to mistreat me and to hurt me, so that way I would not go out and have people look at me. My baby was 4 months old, and I was pregnant again. This is the way I had my second child. When I was 17 years old, I already had a family that was stable already. But the truth is that the mistreatment was evident. I would refuge myself in the consumption of marijuana, and sometimes I would inhale or snort cocaine. And my family would not even imagine everything I was going through in my life. Not much time passed when my children's father went to the military to render military service. It was lieutenant, um, and I was already consuming this while I was caring for my children. I was quite young. I did not know this problem in which I was going to enter on a daily basis. I started meeting these children again, these guys again that I started smoking marijuana with, and there was one that I always liked. I told him everything I had gone through the time that we had not seen each other. He said, "Don't worry about that. You're not going to be alone anymore." He would take my children to like a kindergarten, and then I would smoke marijuana the whole day with him. He will go steal, and I will go to his apartment and wait for him. I will pick up my children, and then we will go to my house to prepare dinner. He would help me with milk and diapers for my children and my rent. Then I was able to find a job at a lottery office as a chances salesperson, and this way I will help support my family. When my brother found out that I was hanging out with them, they took my children away. They sent me to the ICBF office here in Colombia. I was 19 years of age, and this is when I got to know other substances. I tried Bazuco, and the truth is that it was pleasing. It would take me out of the reality. Bazuco was crack here in Colombia, and then I turned 20 years of age. One of those guys from this neighborhood that was bad invited me to go out, and because I did not accept his invitation, he stabbed me 6 times, 4 times on my left arm, once on the right side, and once in my throat. And this is the reason I have this voice tone. These were the side effects of that first mistreatment that I had in the street. I was in the hospital for 1 month. It was something that was terrible. I did not understand why there was such close-minded people that would hurt you to the point of wanting to end your life. But in this world, there isn't any law or justices, or the law was being deaf, blind, and mute. This was not enough for me. On the contrary, I recovered from this, and these guys already had a gang that were attacking people and doing armed robberies. I joined them. It seemed easy with weapons. Who wouldn't be scared of us? We would stick stores, grocery stores, supermarkets, or any business, any house that they would tell us. For me, it was something that was everything was improving in my ignorance. And since I was high most of the time, I was not able to see the danger, the risk, and I felt that was unbeatable. I started consume more crack and I reduced the one from the cocaine. Every time that I started sharing more time, our prizes that we got from stealing, I will go to these crack houses to smoke crack or to blow, as we say it in the street. I will smoke every day and at all times, in any place. Now I was stealing with all these from the apartment. I started doing burglaries, B&Es at an apartments, and I started doing it as they called it in this moment. These partners, sometimes they will even hurt me and they will not give me my part that it will belong to me from all these robberies. And they made me feel that they were the ones who had the power and who ruled the territory. I was violated. There was sometimes that they stabbed me because I did not want to prostitute myself and to sleep with my supposed called partners or my hanging out friends. So if I had a problem with anybody else, I would go hang out somewhere else or with another gang or to another pot. And these people who would start messing with me, I will seek the way that I can eliminate them forever. And yes, these guys will help me. I will make use. I will tell them that I will invite them out on dates so we can go party and then we would finish them up. When I was 23 years of age, I got somebody that was twice my age and I started stealing with him. I felt secure, I felt protected. And for this moment, I had already recovered my children. I went to live with him and my children in his house. He had just finished being freed from prison or released from prison. He was quite recognized in the south part of the city. A lot of people respect him and he was known by a lot of people. When he was 20, when I was 25, I was impregnated again and I had my third child. Three different people, three different children with a blessing. My older children were happy, but I will continue using crack and marijuana. I also started doing it when my son was pregnant, and nowadays, thank God, he was born well. With my partner, we will consume on a daily basis. After 2 years, I was pregnant again. And when I had 8 months and 23 days of pregnancy, I knew it was a beautiful girl. Getting home from the hospital, I fell down the stairs. I broke my membranes and I lost my beautiful daughter. Is an angel that's decorating the heaven. This guy's. Then in 2008, I had an unwishful pregnancy. I had a boy. He was a baby, a kangaroo baby, let's say. He is now 13. In 2011, on August 27th, my husband was murdered by his partners. This was the greatest detonant. My consumption became a priority. I would smoke crack all day and I would close myself up in this drug so I can lose this pain, forget about all this pain. I would stay in these places, in these crack houses, and I would stay for weeks. I was very thin. I was weighing 26 kilograms. I would not eat. I would only smoke, smoke, and smoke. 2014, I had a fight and things got out of hand. I ended up killing someone. I ended up in the Buen Pastor prison on March 19th of 2014, and there I was for 69 months until July 10th of 2021. My stay there, I left that consumption, and then I began with the consumption of Ribotil of 2 milligrams to be more precise. It was in September of 2020 when there was a lawyer who appeared willing to do everything for my freedom. And I was called to do 35 years, or sentenced to do 35 years because of murder. I asked God for another opportunity with the commitment of me leaving this place to change my life around, to become a person that was to live in society and to leave drugs alone. This is the way I started doing a visualization process and the management of anxieties and addictions. I was able to achieve to get this opportunity to reach this Oportunidad de Vida de Camino where I have been since June 30th of 2021 up to date, feeling positive, motivated, and quite centered in my process, with willingness to leave all those negative things behind from my life and to be able to get rid of this past and to be a person of good for me and my family and for my society. Today, I am quite sad of all those girls that live in the street consuming drugs. It's worth the while to mention that because of addictions, the number of those that must prostitute themselves is quite high. And it is very sad to see how they're violated or raped and abused. Most of the times, obliged or forced to become mules because of the fear of not having a dosage of a drug or substance. They're threatened to be murdered against them and against them's families. It's quite depressing to see how, whilst you in the daily drug use, there are other girls, women, and even girls who are raped, abused, hurt, stabbed, shot, discriminated, humiliated, depreciated, and at all times being stepped on just because they're a slave of an addiction and because of different and number of reasons we became the daughters of the largest hell that we have in all the streets of the world, drug addiction. I would like you to know that the disintoxication process, the rehab process, is quite painful. Not physically, it's internal, that we would not want to release. And if we do not do it from our heart and with awareness, we will always be prone to return to this torturous, sad life full of fear and loneliness. Today, I can understand that releasing those or leaving those anxieties behind and managing this hurts a lot. It's very difficult to leave something behind when you were tied to it for half of your life. And once we summarize this, we find out that we didn't get anything positive from it. On the contrary, we lost ourselves as a person, we lost our self-esteem, and we broke all those links and all those love ties that we have with all these important people in our lives until we reach this point or limits when they tell us that they do not believe in you anymore, that they greet you and respect you, but when they look back, they find out that there are no feelings for this person anymore. I am quite clear that this process is quite vital to renovate myself, to it's necessary to do it so we can release all this load behind, all this weight that we sometimes do not want to leave behind as well, but we must. Because of our physical relief, our mental relief, and emotional relief, now that there are so many people that do not know how difficult it is when, why we got to this drug addiction, they call us losers and or crazy people. We are not crazy. Now I accept and recognize that I have been forgiven. I had an addictive disease or illness, but thanks to all those tools and my professional team, I am being cured. Very painful, as I said before, but it is a painful that is beautiful and satisfactory and motivating at the same time to live alone, fixing goals, looking at my purposes for my future with satisfaction of being able to begin from zero or from scratch again. Eva, we're almost done with your time. This fear without any regrets, without any bad feelings, God blesses you on a daily basis and blesses your family on a daily basis. It's nice to open up your eyes to be able to breathe and to live with gratefulness for God. And in this process and in this community, I have first learned to believe in myself, to show myself that it's never late to start again, to reach my goals and dreams, center in my process, motivated to fulfill all my studies, like finishing my high school, study a specialization so I can be a professional and to be able to help people in the necessary things that they need. Thanking God for allowing me to be able to harvest all these feelings with my children who are my priority when I finish this process of physical sanity and emotional ones. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your life, your emotions, your experiences. This also relieves us when we speak about this pain. That is some type of relief. So we will continue with our panel with Dr. Susan Wensley. I will invite her too. She has a presentation that she's going to share. Susan, you have the floor, the microphone is all yours.
Thank you very much. Gracias. I first want to say that I am very honored to be a part of this important panel. I want to talk about substance use and victimization from the perspective of women who are experiencing homelessness in the United States. I first want to acknowledge the important work of the Generation Equality Action Coalition. They listed gender-based violence as the top of 6 critical issues that undermine gender equality. And of course, we know how impactful victimization is, that it is worldwide. So many women experience physical and sexual and psychological violence during their lifetime. And gender and sexual minority women are disproportionately impacted. And the violence that women experience, much of this is due to intimate partners. It is perpetrated by intimate partners, largely, with very serious physical and mental health impacts. Substance use, alcohol and drug use, rates are growing among women. Women are no less likely than men to become addicted to substances. Women are more likely to relapse when they try to stop using. And women face the particular issue that substance use occurs in a social and interpersonal context, and women uniquely experience social and partner pressures to use drugs. And women experience far greater risks to their health because of substance use. And in particular, I want to point out, to a far greater rate than men, the risk of victimization by sexual assault. So in our session, Victimization Through Substance Use, we focus on gender equality. I want to note very strongly that these gender-based inequalities, these prevalent gender-based inequalities and discrimination intersect with other social and economic inequalities that are due to race, they're due to ethnicity, socioeconomic status, homelessness, disability. And in this talk, in which I focus on persons who identify as women and experience homelessness, there would be some representation of those intersectionalities in the United States context. I'd like to share a bit about homelessness in the United States. The United States is one of the wealthier nations in our world. We face challenges too. The definition of homelessness in the United States is the absence of fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence. Homelessness is not an individual's fault. An individual experiencing homelessness is not to blame for that condition, although sometimes people still are blamed. It is a structural problem at its core. It is a result of economic inequalities. It is about inequitable access to resources, to services, the right to a living, and access to affordable housing. And we must also acknowledge that systemic racism and discrimination are at its core as well, because in the United States, it is people of color, for example, Indigenous persons and Black Americans, who are disproportionately more likely to experience homelessness. For women, About 40% of persons experiencing homelessness are women, and there are some unique reasons why women are at risk. We have less earnings over our lifetime than men. We are more likely to live in poverty. We experience the economic impact of victimization by violence, and intimate partner violence is one of the most significant direct causes of homelessness for women. The studies estimate between 25% and 50% of homelessness among women is due to intimate partner violence. And the unique health risks that women face when homeless, much greater sexual victimization risk than men, much greater risk and a history of being sex trafficked. So we consider this relationship between substance use and victimization, this substance use as a cause or facilitator of victimization within an intersectional context of inequalities. One of those inequalities has to do with homelessness. What I would like to do is share some research findings from Los Angeles, California. That is where I am from. That is where I live. That is where I conduct research. Los Angeles, it may not be representative of the entire nation. We have rural areas. Los Angeles is one of the most populous cities in the United States with 4 million people. Los Angeles is per capita one of the capitals of homelessness, has the most persons experiencing homelessness of almost any other city in the United States. We also are one of the top cities involved in sex trafficking. And the Southern California area has a great deal of drug trafficking. So it is in this context that we consider women's experiences. For women, in talking with women, with qualitative, quantitative research over the years, the pronounced dehumanization and disempowerment that women experience, the stigma and lack of respect. And I want to give voice to women's words and read to you. For example, one woman stated, "People who aren't on the streets treat you like expletive. And it's like second nature for you to be in a relationship then, where people treat you so badly." It is about surviving. It is about survival and having limited, if any, power over your own life. You don't want to end up going to the streets for help. You don't want to end up turning to people that are no good for you, but sometimes women do not have a choice. They end up on the streets. And then when you have no resources, you're going to keep scrambling to survive. And if survival sex is one of the solutions to survive, and if you are so emotionally destroyed, then you would say, what the hell? What is my life worth? So profound negative impacts for women if they experience homelessness. I want to share, so we used probability sampling, random sampling from the population of women experiencing homelessness and a similar population of housed women, also of low income, and the rates of victimization by physical and sexual violence were higher, clearly, for the women experiencing homelessness. Rates of drinking. Now, I want to say that women experiencing homelessness, that is a heterogeneous population. And not all women are drinking or using drugs, many are. The rates of this health challenge are far higher among women experiencing homelessness. And over the past few years, the most commonly used substance for women experiencing homelessness and men has been methamphetamine. It is also the case that the leading cause of death among men and women experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles is overdose. It is overdose from substance use. So let's look at some ways in which substance use leads to victimization. Again, through women's words, it's most important to share the women's voices. It is an interpersonal context. My boyfriend wanted me to go and get drugs. I refused. I told him I did not feel like using that day. I was hungry. He did not feed me. He commenced pushing me down. He kicked me and he kicked me. Or he wanted more drugs than what I gave him, and I wasn't going to give him no more. He wasn't happy with that. So he got real mad and started beating me up. And then he pulled the gun. So there are stories like this where these difficult interpersonal interactions regarding drug use. Overall, in our research, we found that in women's social networks, in their social groups, when they had more drinkers and drug users, then the women were using more alcohol and drugs. The more that women had intimate partners who used drugs and drank, then the more alcohol and drugs the women used. Again, think about that social pressure and lack of choice, especially if they depend on those intimate partners to help them survive. Partners often used violence against women, while both the partners and the women were drinking or using drugs together. And some of this violence stemmed directly from selling drugs or sex trafficking, sex trade. And women often used drugs or alcohol during these interactions. So many stories about women who, if they're living on the streets, might choose one partner, might stay in the tent with one partner to, even if that person victimizes them, because that is better than having to contend with many men on the street who might also victimize her. And women respond in the ways that we understand. Women talk about extreme emotional upset, traumatic stress, psychological distress. They blame themselves. So many of the women blame themselves and not the perpetrator for the violence that had occurred to them in the interviews that we conducted. And then a number of them reported specifically increasing their use of alcohol and drugs after experiencing these traumatic events, after being victimized by partners. So it is very important to understand and to talk about the victimization that occurs because of substance use, but we must also address the substance use that follows the victimization, because that is a cycle. That is the vicious cycle that must be broken. And it's important to talk about because the victimization among many women experiencing homelessness was not just yesterday, it was not just last year, but it may be a cumulative experience of adversity and trauma during their lives. Much higher rates among the women we interviewed of childhood victimization at the hands of adults. And physical and sexual victimization and psychological victimization by partners is not the only victimization women experience. There are other traumatic events during the lifetime. Children may be taken from women and put into foster care. 57% of women we interviewed had been incarcerated, and 61% of women in federal prisons in the United States have been incarcerated because of nonviolent drug crimes. That is an injustice. Many of the women report having loved ones that were injured or killed, shot. So it is a cumulative trauma, often across the lifetime. And some of our work and others' work, we find that certainly victimization leads to substance use, and it is often the psychological stress, the post-traumatic stress, the depression that increases as a result of victimization that then leads to substance use. But there are solutions supports and services can address the victimization, the depression, the substance use. And we need to talk more about that. This is of critical importance, adequate resources and services. A woman talked about just a couple of years ago in an interview, when I was in a tent, I would get drunk and be assaulted. Since getting into housing, my own place to live, I've had a few relapses, but I don't drink as much. Just having this housing and supports, you're safer inside. It changes your lifestyle and opportunities. And that is a fundamental issue for women experiencing homelessness. The streets are not safe. There is no safety there. Housing makes a difference, and it is a human right as declared by the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. There are so many implications. The safe, stable, non-time limited, affordable, subsidized housing that is critical for persons experiencing homelessness, men and women, so that people don't need to worry about simply surviving any longer, but can take care of themselves better and think about their futures and think about their children. But along with that, the big issue is we need to redouble our commitment across spheres, across the legal sphere, medical, social, a commitment to address those discriminatory gender norms, the racism and the biases that lead to disparities, that lead women to be disempowered, and that lead them to the harms, including victimization and substance use. Women deserve to have the opportunity not to have higher rates of poverty than men. Women deserve the opportunity for employment, adequate education, equitable income. And a very important matter for women in terms of receiving services, women's voices must be heard. Women must shape the service strategies. Women must shape the priorities for themselves. And accessible, culturally sensitive, gender-focused services and support are necessary for substance use, mental health, and trauma. In the United States, and I know certainly in Los Angeles, there's been a lot of emphasis on what is called trauma-informed care. This is a recognition that many people have a pervasive experience, the pervasive nature of trauma. And it's a recognition of that, and it is a promotion of a whole environment of healing and recovery. I note the Downtown Women's Center in Los Angeles, a women-only focused services and housing for women experiencing homelessness. They use trauma-informed care in everything they do. It is a center of excellence for women experiencing homelessness. And I think that I will end there as my time is almost up. And gracias.
Muchas gracias, Susan, por tu presentación. Seguimos con Marilyn.
We will continue with Marilyn. Dr. Marilyn Clark, you have the floor.
Ella también nos va a compartir una
She's also going to share a presentation.
Okay, good afternoon. I would
Buenas
also like
tardes. A mí también me gustaría.
I'd also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference. And in fact, my presentation is going to reiterate a number of points that both Eva and Suzanne have made in their presentations before me. Understanding gender is a critical requirement to developing effective policies and practice responses to substance use. We know that women experience different addiction career trajectories. They also have different experiences of the criminal justice system. This therefore leads to a number of treatment and reintegration challenges that are particular to women. As Suzanne has already mentioned, gender obviously intersects with a number of other structural variables such as race, class, etc., that make women more vulnerable. Gender mainstreaming is a core objective of the United Nations. It's also an important pillar in the EU drug action strategy. And this means that at all levels, one must ensure that a gender perspective is actively and visibly mainstreamed into all practices, policies, and programs. And when we look at substance use in the general population, we see that substance use is more common amongst men, especially where regular, intensive, and problematic use is concerned. In fact, according to the United Nations, nearly 7 out of 10 people who use drugs are men. Women also engage in less treatment uptake, so we see them less commonly in treatment. And perhaps this lower prevalence and more hidden use and less treatment access has led to less understanding with regards to the issues facing women who use drugs. And the gender gap is narrowing. In some countries, for example, we see that amongst school-age populations, girls and boys have achieved near parity. But we do find this primarily for school-age populations. I did want to mention, and I have heard this mentioned in other sessions during this conference, that with some categories of substances, for example, the non-medical use of prescription drugs, women tend to be found in higher numbers. With regards to the addiction career trajectory, we see gender differences manifesting themselves in all stages. For example, with regards to initiation of drug use, recent literature has shown that female onset tends to occur at an earlier age. And women also tend to experiment with different drugs more than their male counterparts. However, one thing that is often commonly found in the addiction careers in terms of initiation of women is that they're often introduced to hard drugs through a significant relationship, such as a boyfriend, a partner, or a spouse. In terms of escalation of the addiction career trajectory, we see that women develop substance use disorders and drug-related problems more rapidly than men. In fact, this phenomenon has been aptly called telescoping. And consequently, they also experience more health-related consequences. These have already been identified by Suzanne. And also, I just want to mention the inclusion of comorbid disorders and complex trauma that I will be discussing more in detail later on. With regards to the end of the addiction career or the desistance stage, we do know that once women are addicted to a substance, they find it harder to quit. And women also tend to seek care in mental health or primary care settings rather than in specialized treatment programs. And this is probably as a result of the fact that treatment programs have been designed with men in mind, and therefore they may not be so accessible to women. In fact, women have been known to experience greater difficulty in gaining access to effective treatment because they're often responsible for childcare. They may be involved in drug trafficking, as we have heard, as drug couriers. They're extensively exposed to violence and sex work. I will now zero into exploring the link, which the previous presenters have already brought up, between substance use and victimization. We do know that there is a link. The direction of the relationship is not entirely clear. Personally, my opinion is that the link between substance use and victimization is reciprocal. We've talked a bit about sort of America and Latin America, and in Europe as well, we do see that gender-based violence or violence against women is alive and well. In fact, in a fundamental rights agency survey in 2014, 1 in every 33% of women who were surveyed had experienced violence since the age of 15, and 8% of those had experienced violence in the last year. We do know that while men are more likely to experience, to be victims of a crime, women are more likely to experience psychological and sexual abuse, and also to be violated by someone they know within the domestic setting. It has already been mentioned how women's victimization careers often begin in childhood and unfold over time. And women are often exposed continuously to multiple forms of abuse. They are unfortunately also exposed to secondary victimization within the criminal justice system, as well as within the wider community. Women who use drugs are also reporting additional conditions of vulnerability related to the experience of violence. So, for example, in a recent study by Tirado Munoz et al., 68% of injecting drug women had experienced interpersonal violence in the most intimate relationship. What are the consequences of victimization? So perhaps the most notable response to victimization is trauma-related symptoms. Trauma may be defined as an intense emotional response arising from inescapable and stressful events that overwhelm an individual's coping mechanisms. More recently, psychologists and psychotherapists, helping professionals have been talking about complex trauma, which is somewhat different from trauma in that the focus is on the response to something that is occurring repeatedly and cumulatively over a period of time, to violence that escalates over its duration, and to victimization that occurs within specific interpersonal relationships. So if we look at the symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, we see that in addition to the experience of a sense of threat, avoidance of the traumatic situation and re-experiencing of the event, women who experience complex trauma also experience interpersonal disturbances, a negative self-concept, and affect dysregulation. I'm now going to talk to you about a study, be discussing a study that a colleague of myself conducted in 2019, and which was published in the Journal of Forensic Practice. And this was a qualitative study whereby we interviewed 14 women who had substance use disorders and were at the time of interview either residing in treatment or in prison. And one thing that emerged is that childhood and continued victimization played a significant part in their drug use pathways. So most of these 14 women reported experiencing neglect, physical and sexual and emotional abuse from family members. This has already been mentioned in earlier presentations, at a very young age, but predominantly from male family members. And they experienced this over an extended period of time. So like Susanna, I do want to give voice to the women who participated in this study. So here Valentina tells us that she was sexually abused between the ages of 5 and 6, right till the age of 11 by her brother and her brother-in-law. And Jane tells us that she was sexually abused by her cousin from the age of 4 until 12. Many of these women also reported being witnesses as children to domestic violence. So Sasha here had experienced her father stabbing her mother a number of times and then leaving. One thing that the women spoke to us about as well was something that has been called cross-generational boundary diffusion. This basically is referring to the assignment of adult roles during childhood and can be considered as a form of victimization. So Clara here is talking about how at a young age she was tasked with looking after an elderly family member away from the family home, and this increased the opportunity for sexual abuse. What is the most intrusive consequence of early victimization? What emerged from this study is that the most important consequence of this was on identity. Basically, the self-perception of these women as deserving of abuse. And in the study, we call this a victim identity, which is characterized by a sense of powerlessness, a lack of control, a lack of agency, and a loss of self-worth. So here Clara tells us that the more time passed, the more it seemed like something normal for me. So much so that by the time I reached my youth, I had lost all my dignity. So basically what these women are talking about here is that victimization elicits feelings of shame within themselves. Shame has been conceptualized as experienced, internalized aggression. The belief that these women allowed the abuse to happen provokes a sense of shame. So here, Sue penned a letter to her inner child, where she says, I saw you at the age of 10 again, ashamed again, playing dirty games with your cousin. At age 12, I am seeing you abused, dirty. He used you, his use was painful. He threw you away after 20 minutes. So shame is a painful emotion. This internalized aggression towards the self is very, very painful and is consequently concealed. So Pia tells us how she was just swallowing. She never disclosed. And Katie talks about how she felt so much shame. And you don't share this with anyone. So basically, this early victimization plays a part in the development of beliefs about oneself as weak, defective, inadequate, and abused. And the repeated activation of these schemas leads them to becoming dominant over other schemata. So in terms of the substance use trajectory, how did the victimization impact on substance use? So we hypothesized from the data that the onset of substance use was an attempt by these women to self-medicate the emotional distress. So Clara tells us that when she tried drugs, it changed everything. She didn't feel anything anymore. I felt nothing anymore. And Jane talks about how drugs used to make her feel numb from everything. The women also talked about how they were initiated into hard drugs, and this initiation was facilitated or even coerced by older males. So Sasha experienced a very early onset at the age of 12 to heroin use, and she was initiated to this by a male partner who was 10 years older than her. And these experienced male partners often take on the role of teachers. As these women got older and continued with their addiction careers, they continued to experience victimization, which may also have been increased by the fact that they were substance users. So here you've got a number of documentations by these women, which points towards a shift from childhood experiences of abuse perpetrated by family members to becoming the victims of interpersonal violence. And central to interpersonal violence is basically a structurally entrenched power imbalance between men and women. So here we have experiences of extreme violence. In the last case, Sophie was pregnant when her partner attacked her, and she lost her twin babies. So participants continued to define themselves primarily in the light of the victim identity developed during childhood, as each interpretation of violence is based upon prior experiences. So we hypothesize from the data that these shame-based schemata are solidified through repeated activation during prolonged victimization. So Katie here tells us that she stayed with her partner who used to beat her. It got to the point where I started thinking, I'm not worth it. I don't know any better. This is all my fault. One thing that emerged extremely explicitly in the data was the presence of sexual exploitation and coercion into prostitution by the women we interviewed. So Sasha, for example, at the age of 14, was coerced into prostitution by her partner. And in terms of their sex work careers, these women were subjected to enduring traumatic experiences. So, for example, Sasha again tells us that she was beat up several times while on the street and has the war scars to show for it. This also led to intense emotional distress and shame. Within the European context, the European Parliament resolution of 2014 has identified prostitution and forced prostitution as gendered phenomenon. And the vast majority of prostituted persons are in fact women and underage females, while most buyers are men. And therefore prostitution may be seen as a cause and consequence of gender inequality. We looked at the experiences of prostitution from a radical feminist perspective, and we interpret these experiences as stemming from male domination and objectification, as opposed to perhaps more liberalist feminist discourse, which might see this, which might view sex work as a form of gender liberation. Our understanding of the data was that prostitution was inherently victimizing and reinforced the power imbalance between men and women. We have seen already how prostituted persons often require more medical care than the general population. Their mortality rate is higher, and many of them wish to leave their career, sex work careers, but find it difficult to do so. A common theme that emerged from the data was the experience of shame and stigmatization. Traditional constructions of femininity further amplify the labeling process for these women, who are not only viewed as breaking societal norms, but also the norms of femininity. And this emerges as particularly salient in the Maltese context, which is a context characterized by a significantly Catholic society, where women remain primarily visible within their domestic roles. Clearly, the data also indicated that for women to desist effectively, they require to experience a shift in their social identity and their personal identity, and to shed off the addict role and the shame, as well as these spoiled identities. So by way of conclusion, I propose a number of remedies. Historically, national drug strategies and the ensuing policies have poorly engaged with gender considerations when identifying their target populations, with the exception of a limited range of policies regarding pregnancy and motherhood, which is how women are mostly apprehended in the political arena. So I make a plea here for countries to address gender-specific needs better in their drug policies. I think it was Susanna who already mentioned how treatment needs to be gender responsive and more specifically needs to take a trauma lens. So there's a lot of research indicating now that trauma-informed practice that is addressing the underlying issues of victimization and shame is the best way forward for engaging women in treatment. We also need to address the significant barriers that women experience when attempting to seek help, and these are clearly documented in the literature. But perhaps most important of all, we need to recognize that women have a right to live lives free of violence, and that tinkering around the margin with policies that neatly fit into our existing power structures but fail to seriously challenge dominant assumptions is no longer good enough for lasting change to occur. So basically, we need to eradicate the root cause of gender-based violence, which is basically a systematic pattern of female disadvantage and male privilege. And so broad structural change at a societal level is needed. Very important as well, and this is significantly an important pillar in the latest EU drug action strategy, is the reduction of stigma and the recognition that continuing to punish women who use drugs is likely to result in their further alienation rather than and promotes rather than extinguishes substance use and related problems. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a ti, Marlene. Muchas gracias a las tres.
Thanks to all three of you. And, actually, we have three questions. And before going to them, I would like to do a rapporteur of all the intervention. Eva, well, first, the title. The title of your presentation, Finding Heaven After Going Through Hell, is really very significant of what we spoke of how to overcome this drama, how to do for us to be able to somehow find a pathway in spite of all those hells that we may have had to live, that we have seen in the different presentation. You tell us really the spiral that the other colleagues have actually mentioned, which is the spiral that starts with they change the notebooks for diapers. Exclusion, lack of opportunity, and then comes this spiral of abuse that Mari actually read and told us several testimonies that actually point to the same, and how we begin to lose faith. It kills hope. And that is why when policies and programs are punitive, they really don't help. Because when faith has been lost, what you need is affection. So thank you very much for having opened your heart and told that experience. And then another phrase that you use, what is the law in the street, is to be deaf, blind, and mute. And that actually ingrains in the soul. So part of the programs have to do, you have to talk and listen to be able to see and understand. Very, very interesting your work. And well, and lots of luck in this process of with the association. I think that is a very, very powerful. And then Susan was speaking to us about the importance of the home. And when she was saying that it's not necessary to live in a mattress in the streets, because to live of that being an errand, just moving from one place to another, that is one of the detonators, because evidently, like all mentioned, the consumption becomes in sort of a soothing drug to forget all the hardships. So these issues of the basic things that you cannot have some temporary homes, because that really doesn't solve. These are hinge moments, but what are the policies to protect women so that this stop? I mean, this is a work that is very difficult to do. And you were speaking also of racism, sexism, that we also see it in our countries, how women, Black women, indigenous, Native Americans as well, the ones that have some sort of disability, they don't have venues or support. And she said something that you mentioned, and that was something that actually points to hope. If I am already destroyed, what was it to her? What the hell? Because there's nothing to lose anymore and nothing more to expect. So it's that hopelessness, the issue of guilt that Marilyn mentioned. It actually, they hit me, they abuse of me, and I am the one that provoked it. I am the guilty one. These vicious cycles of victimization that Marilyn was also speaking about, that are other of the things that we need to achieve through transforming the role of the victim in survivors, in warriors, in multipliers, not to happen to others. That is very therapeutic, the issue of recovering dignity and to manage trauma. That multi-trauma that they spoke about, I thought that these are very powerful concepts. And sometimes we don't keep them in mind. You know, we just see the symptom at the instant. The husband is hitting them right now, but behind that, what wounds are open that have not healed, and that they continue to feed that horrendous, vicious spiral. And then I'll just have to say thank you very much for this marvelous these marvelous knowledges that they were shared. And now let's go with the question. The first question is for Eva. And she says, what do you consider important to help dignify women that live in the streets? Eva, please. Well, firstly, I want to say thank you for this opportunity, for leaving a message to you of what we Latin women live through, what we live in Colombia. And I think that the opportunities for them or for us, and I would include it because so far I am now starting my process, it's actually to increase greater spaces where we can study, to have academic opportunities, labor opportunities, training in respect of consumption, of inhabiting the streets, homelessness. But I think that most important thing of all of this, that every woman give her the opportunity to love oneself. I think that's the key. Love yourself. And another thing that I think that actually impacts the consumption of women is that whenever they begin to consume, the ones that are mothers, they take away our children. So that is a very big void that you can't fill at that time, and you end up making bad decisions when that happens. So spaces to train yourself, works, psychosocial work to cure and to be able to love oneself, and that there be policies so that we protect maternity in spite of the consumption. In spite of the consumption. Okay, fine. Well, thank you very much, Eva. Thank you very much, and may God bless you all. And the second question is for Mari. What are the best practices that we could actually have at the service to be able to break the cycle between victimization and substance use?
Was that for me?
¿Para quién fue eso?
Tienes el micrófono cerrado.
Yes, it was. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Best practices. So essentially,
Las mejores prácticas.
I think a lot of research.
Ya, adelante. Perdona.
I think a lot of research indicates, like both Susanna and myself mentioned, that we need to address the trauma. Okay, and today we're also talking about complex trauma. Professionals have started to explore the idea that it's not simple PTSD that needs to be dealt with in treatment, but more complex PTSD, which focuses on extended experiences of abuse, things that women have had to live with for long periods of time. And related to this, again, emanating from this particular research, was the victim identity. So I think it came out clear from all the presentations that what happens to these women is that they come to see themselves as deserving of abuse. Okay, and therefore we need to, in order for them to be successfully moving into conventional roles, then they need to shed those spoiled identities. They need to let go of a vision of themselves as deserving of abuse. They need to learn to develop self-love, as Eva has just said. And, this is a really important, it's not just a cliche, but they need to move away from looking at themselves as potentially victims and to be empowered. Now, in terms of best practices, I would also agree with Eva that allowing women to maintain their maternal roles is a very important good practice. So in my country, when women seek treatment and they are known to be substance abusers and have children, social services come in, and very often this results in the removal of the children, which is devastating for the women, and this often propels their careers further rather than stopping them. So being a mother can be a hook for change. It's very important for us to allow women to have that, to not punish them, but to help them in their search for a better life.
De acuerdo, Marilyn. El amor, ¿no? Otra vez, el amor
There's
como...
love, once again, love as this great healer. And of course, art, how the possibility of expressing and healing actually has to do with this. For us, this has been a fundamental tool because we have to talk it out. And sometimes we cannot talk. Sometimes it's actually easier to sing, to paint, to scream, and even at times, so love and that, this complex trauma, I will keep those words to thought, is food for thought, because I think that they're ultimately very powerful concepts. And now, ultimate for Susan, the other question that we did, what recommendations would you give to formulate and execute public policy in these matters?
Well, going back to the issue of the right
Bueno,
to housing, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development has already been investing in what is called permanent supportive housing, using a housing first model. And that is to enable individuals to move into a place of their own in a harm reduction manner, so that people are not forced to engage in any treatments they do not consider priority for themselves at that time. So that fundamental need of safe housing is important, but much of the policy has not been overtly tailored to women. There are specializations for youth, for veterans, but women in particular, and families, but women in particular, regarding the gender sensitive care, that has not been an articulated policy. So when women who are experiencing homelessness do have the opportunity for housing, then they can begin working on these complex traumas. They have a safe space, headspace, and food security, and other issues. The problem is we have so little affordable housing in the United States. It is such a travesty that there is this disparity, but it does exist. So many people do not have that opportunity for housing readily.
Muchas gracias, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. Right, so I don't know if we have any other further minutes. I don't know if someone wants to say any additional closing comments of what we work. And once again, I am just kind of inducing this. What do you think of the work with art? What experiences do you have in healing and spirituality through the arts? I don't know, not religious, there's of being a being for life and being a being prepared for death. Have you had any experiences with homeless people? We have 7 minutes to share this. Have you had any experiences with women like that? Anyone, Susan, Marilyn, anyone who wishes to have experience with that?
If I may, yes, there is in an area in downtown Los Angeles called Skid Row, and this is a dense concentration of persons experiencing homelessness, many living on the streets, and there are art projects. And it's a very fulfilling experience to be able to engage in something that takes one out of the immediate survival. That is the opportunity to create and tap those talents. I would also like to mention that amidst all the hopelessness that we hear, women also say things like, we have to conquer the monsters and the mountains. We have to tap resilience. Women do have deep reserves of resilience. That is why they're able to survive these circumstances.
Muchas gracias, Susan. Marilyn, ¿quieres compartir algo?
Thank you very much. Marilyn, would you like to add on something to the issue?
With regards to the experience of art projects, I'm afraid it's not something that I have any experience with. However, I would agree with Suzanne that anything that can get people out of themselves and that can foster strengths as opposed to always focusing on deficits. I think this is really important. For me as well, resilience is a very important aspect of human development. And especially when we talk about trauma, we also need to consider that people can experience post-traumatic growth. Okay, so, just because people have experienced a trauma does not mean that they need to stay with that. They can actually develop growth. There's a lot of research about this now that makes them even stronger, bouncing back from adversity as a result of the difficulties that they have encountered. So I think strength-based perspectives are really important. And this might incorporate art projects. I'm afraid it's not something I know much about.
Todos estamos aprendiendo, ¿no? Un poco. Eva,
We
adelante.
are all learning somehow. Eva, do you want to share something? Well, I would like to tell you perhaps that part of the activities that we have in the Camino community, we hear the activities, we call this forming actions, which are the venues that we have to find ourselves with psychologists, pedagogues, and promoters, which are our professional team. And we have a forming action that is called Dance, Movement, and Therapy, Professor. And this is a place where we recognize ourselves, the negative things and the emotions, where we can express them through corporal arts, the performing arts. This is something that is very, very, very positive. Truly, it really, the art, the dance allows you to express it out, to unload those burdens that we actually fall on our backs as we walk the streets. Fantastic, Eva. And we have one last question, and we have 5 minutes. So we're going to go with this, and with that we'll close. If the intervention with gender perspective should adopt a perspective of trauma, how would one transfer this need to the topic of prevention of consumption, the prevention of consumption? Is that clear, or should I read it just one more time? Please go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my presentation, I spoke about one of the remedies I proposed is tackling gender-based violence. So basically, I think, the issue here is bigger than substance use. And the issue here is basically a situation where women continue to be, to find themselves in situations of dominant, submission and male dominance. So in terms of prevention, I mean, we could spend all our efforts telling people not to use drugs and engaging them in healthy pursuits, etc. But if we know that one of the precursors and one of the continued factors influencing women's substance use trajectories is the gender-based violence, then we need to address the root of gender-based violence in order to prevent it. And that is basically, gender equality, which is one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So I would say, yes, absolutely, it does have to do with prevention as well, because if we change the structures and, in society, then this is going to positively impact girls and women and consequently substance use.
De acuerdo, muchas gracias, Marlene.
Fully
Susan?
agree, Marilyn. Thank you very much. Susan, would you like to add on to her comments?
Well, I certainly agree with what Marilyn talked about in terms of root cause. We must recognize that there are fundamental disparities based on gender, and addressing those will reduce the likelihood overall that women will be victimized, will turn to substances.
Totalmente de acuerdo. Entonces, un poco al
Fully
cierre.
in agreement. So now in the closing, love, listening, a fixed home, changing of policy of maternity, and handling the family aspects in respect of substance use, and to continue to work that we have gender equity so that we have a reality and not just speeches, because so far the low levels is not trickling all the way down, down, down. There are many theoretical things that we have been unable to turn into a reality in the territories. That's where people change. I mean, yes, I think that you can make the transition because of the treatment one that you have there, but it is the change that installs itself in the community. And with this, I would like to thank you and invite you. There's to our fourth block, which is the final block of this gathering of several days that we have had on the subject matter. The subject matter that we'll have is the interventions on consumption with female population prevention and treatment and reduction of damages. And well, I would like to wish you the best.
Yo estaba hablando con el micrófono apagado todo el tiempo. ¿No me oyeron? ¿O sí?
I was speaking all this time and no one was listening to me.
¿Qué oímos? Susana?
Sí, sí te oímos, pero el último pedazo no.
Yes, I heard you the last piece.
Pues que los invitaba al bloque
No, I
4,
wanted to invite you to the fourth block,
las intervenciones sobre el
which is the
consumo
intervention on the consumption of women and the reduction of damage, and giving our speakers. I would like to thank them, and I wanted to invite Eva to the Bronx district of area where we're carrying out a project with homeless people and people who consume drugs, especially women, and I'd like to thank the ministry and the United Nations for allowing me to be here with you, allowing me to learn beside you too. So the speakers would like to say bye. Eva, can you invite me, when you tell me where you invited me again, to the creative district where of the Bronx, where the L was at before? Thank you very much for the invitation. We will be there. I would also like to thank you for offering us this space and the opportunity for me as a woman, ex-homeless person, ex-consumer of these drugs. It is quite gratifying. The truth is that I feel quite unloaded of all these things, to being able to share these with you, things that no one has ever known, and now I can share these things with you. God bless you all.
Adelante, Marilyn.
Go ahead, Marilyn. You would like to say bye?
I just wanted to say thank you. It was a wonderful
Sí, me gustaría
opportunity.
agradecerles. Fue una gran oportunidad para mí.
I particularly wanted to thank Eva for sharing
Me
her
gustaría agradecerle a
experience
Eva
with
por
us.
compartir sus
It was
experiencias.
amazing. Everybody, but yeah, hearing it from, you know, that was a really good experience. Thank you all.
Perfecto, en este momento estamos con imagen y música al aire.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Susana, Eva, Marilyn,
Good night.
Susan.
¿Yo la música?
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos y todas. Les damos la bienvenida a quienes se
We would like
conectan
to
a
welcome you for those who are connecting themselves for this last panel of this 3-day event dedicated to from the view or the perspective on the demand of consumption of justice makes part of the consumption of the perspective of gender. I present myself, I'm Luis Mejia, and I'm going to lead this blog, which has been co-intervention on consumption of the female population prevention, treatment, and harm reduction. I'm going to give you a beginning framework where before I present these three speakers of this blog, number four, the first thing is that this whole event of 3 days and in particular day, this agenda has been dedicated, or makes part, let's say, of a very important effort of putting this in the agenda that's very important and urgent to release the things that are happening that have been around the world. This is an agenda when we're speaking about consumption with women. It's something that's recent and not more than a decade. Is development of blocks interventions, which is in early stages, and the evidence that it's just beginning to be seen. There's also a beginning development plan for the self-organization of women and the reduction of harm in this gender that has not been around for more than five years in development with some experiences in some countries. Implies to understand this a female before drugs, which is what our speakers gonna speak about, and the prior panel was also introducing this dynamics in a really strong way. And this does not only happen with the numbers itself, but tell us that there's a great difference that we have seen throughout these 3 days before the use in men as well, which is a gap that is reducing more every day. More women are using drugs now. Now, there's a great difference in the biological manners, the reasons why they use this, the differentiating impact that takes women to use this in cultural environments where machismo and all these imaginary things that they must be and do in the societies, and that defines them. So here we have great susceptibility on the disorders. This has been marked, shown by evidence in a systematic way. It requires less doses and less time to develop an addiction or disorder because of this substances, the craving for the consumption and the relapse of this is more relevant on women. Amongst them, there's a greater incidence of craving, and these are risk factors that are important. There's great sensitivity of the impact of certain drugs, greater risk of arriving to emergency rooms or dying of an overdose. And we know there's evidence that's very strong that has just been presented in a very strong way, which was in panel number 3. 75% of women who enters treatment have reports that they have lived with sexual abuse. 90% of the women who have the disorder of use of alcohol made part of parenthood, who were abused sexually at an early age. At the beginning, this is with the consumption during a relationship. They're sometimes assisted or initiated by their partners in the relationships when they begin the youth career, the relationships, and they ask for help in a later stage, which exposes them to more time and all this risk that is associated to all this consumption. They have these fears that are marked among them. They're scared of asking for help, and this is something that makes them go out to work sexually and to carry out this domestic violence if their partners are also drug users, and of course the material dependency that is very common in many of these women. There are also structural violence victims in this systematic way, which have been marked throughout these 3 days. The incarceration rates of all this Anglo-centric, or some treatments that have been designed particularly for men, from studies that only inquire all the men, the stigma, greater scrutiny, and we see this depression in women. Most of this, the linkage of these subjective networks and of support and great loneliness as well. This is very common and transversal in this women's life when they use drugs. Victims of internal stigma that has also been proposed in the previous panel on this. They're victims who integrates many things and it messes up their self-esteem, and then they begin to think that they're bad girls, bad wives, bad daughters, bad mothers, and whatever comes along with this. So whatever comes with this is what they deserve, and they cannot hope for anything else. So this all shows, so we can commence, and for me to introduce my speakers that we have here in the panel that have very many vulnerabilities that affects women in a great way and that merits allows us to go beyond the numbers of inequality of materials, lack of opportunities among others. To advance in this care of public policies, specifically in the one, the right of being cared for, and we have mentioned this and we are going to speak about this in the panel. So for this session, we are accompanied by Maria Mercedes Sueñas Bobon. She is the head of the consumption reduction in the UNODC office. She carried out studies of law in the San Buenaventura University in Cali and a Bachelor of Dramatic Art in the University of Badis. She specializes in social management and from the University of Javeriana and international corporate from the Oviedo University in Spain. She linked herself to join the Office of United Nations in May 1999 as management, and she got to slow down of the National Plan for Drugs. In 2007, she was chosen for the same project, and she assumed the head of this department in UNODC to date. She has made part as an author of different publications related to with the topic of drug consumption. She also performed as a professor at the University of Javeriana in the planning of the educational faculty and San Miguel University in pharmacodependency topics. We are also accompanied by Carmen Meneses Falcón from the Pontificia Comillas University from Spain. Carmen is a doctor in anthropology and social and cultural anthropology in researches and postgraduate and undergraduate from the Universidad Pontificia Comillas in Madrid. She has a huge background in analysis and competitiveness in gender, drug consumption, and social exclusion. She was the director for the gender research for these topics, and right now she's doing research on the. She needs to stop reading. And last one, we are accompanied by Denise Dominguez. She makes part of the San Luis Comunidad Foundation in Spain. She's a psychology feminist in the SPY Ariadna in the health community. You see, she is had a bachelor from psychology from the Autónoma Metropolitan. It's important for me to say, excuse me, Berenice, and master's in drug dependency from the Barcelona University. Welcome to all. And let's begin. Maria Mercedes, please go ahead with your presentation named The Science of Prevention and Gender Issues, Warfares. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Inés Elvira. Un saludo a todos los participantes. Voy a proceder a poner la presentación.
Share my presentation.
No la encuentro. ¿Dónde dice evento SIMSI? Dios, no la encuentro ahora.
Tranquila.
¿Me ayudas? Porque no, o sea, no la veo.
Toma el tiempo.
O sea, tengo aquí el PowerPoint listo. Le doy compartir pantalla. Discúlpenme, pero no veo. ¿Dónde está mostrar todas las ventanas? Ya, discúlpenme, ya. Ya, discúlpenme, ya. Discúlpenme, esto pasa. todos los
Esto
días.
pasa, tranquila. Estamos muy habituados en esta vida virtual que todos
los días.
Sí.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Yo voy a contarles un poquito como las reflexiones que hemos hecho desde la oficina sobre estos temas de prevención, también algo de tratamiento y cómo desde Naciones Unidas se viene impulsando este tema de, digamos, de la equidad de género y de incorporar el asunto de género en los programas, en las políticas y en todos los proyectos que desarrollamos. Lo primero es entender que existen unos estándares internacionales de uso de drogas. Esos estándares internacionales son como un conjunto de lineamientos y de criterios que se construyeron a partir de la revisión de una literatura científica, de investigaciones y de proyectos en donde una serie de expertos de diferentes partes del mundo lograron revisar qué era lo que funcionaba y lo que no funcionaba en prevención. Y de aquí quiero como comentar dos o tres cosas que me parecen súper importantes. Una es que una de las conclusiones es que la prevención no solo digamos, en su objetivo más próximo, por supuesto que es evitar o retardar el consumo, pero tiene unos fines superiores, y esos fines superiores es hablar de desarrollo saludable y seguro de las niñas y los niños.
From childhood and as the text says of the youngest, and this puts us in tune and to understand that there's a proposal so we can have equity of gender, so women can have the same opportunities that men have, and this would allow them to have this healthy and safe or secure development. So this is a broad bet that then only centering in the framework of prevention to delay the age of beginning to consume this, or if they have consumed this, to avoid it to become an abusive consumption. And these standards also tell us that efficient prevention favors the participation of girls
en sus entornos. Y esos entornos pues son sus entornos donde pasa la vida, la familia, la escuela, la comunidad, el lugar de trabajo. Sin embargo, cuando se quiere entrar al detalle de esa evidencia, ¿qué ha pasado con el enfoque de género? Entonces, los estándares no muestran claramente, digamos, hay 1, 2 o 3 proyectos que logran mostrar unas diferencias entre las intervenciones que se hacen con niñas o con niños, y esto es sobre todo en el caso de la prevención. Es mucho más claro el enfoque cuando se habla de tratamiento. La igualdad de género es una prioridad para Naciones Unidas. Desde el UNGAS del 2016, esta asamblea invita a los países miembros y invita a la cooperación internacional a incorporar la perspectiva de género en todos los programas y políticas, asegurar que en todas las etapas de la elaboración, ejecución, seguimiento y evaluación se incorpore esta perspectiva, que haya medidas que tengan en cuenta las necesidades específicas de las mujeres y las niñas, que sean adecuadas para ellas, que los estados
can apply the Convention on the Elimination of all the discrimination ways against women or manners against women. This is a purpose, and this is a calling to all those countries that ratify themselves in this UNLAD from 2016, and which makes part of the mandate that UNODC has for the help so this can happen. And we also have, as we have already mentioned in the other conferences, the objectives of sustainable purposes, and this is also a framework that is quite expanded or broad, and where these prevention and treatment stages number 3 and number 5 is very strong, which is guarantee us healthy life and secure or stages in all ages. And 2, these both purposes, which is of mandate and of compliance for all of us, is to drive the inclusion in gender perspectives in all policies in the drug matters. From the other hand, on the UNODC, we have an internal strategy for the gender equality for women that has 2 purposes. One, that is to be able to achieve this empowerment in a collective organization and programmatic way, and this means that not only is to the external part, but it's internal part for the officials or on everything that we develop with all these technical groups and in all the internal programs that are organizational in all the levels. We should have this endeavor to try to achieve this women empowerment. And on the other hand, our view in the UNODC is to give them some structured support so they can comply with the commitments and we can incorporate this gender perspective. This is a strategy that works and that it has some clear indicators where it invites us to do the work inside the institute and to support all the member states in this purpose. The inequality of gender are affecting the opportunities of these women, of course, so they can begin in consumption, and for those who are in the process of rehab to maintain themselves. In this sense, do you haven't seen these numbers? We already can see that the drugs, that the services at a global level for these women that have these disorders because of the use of drugs are higher than those concrete numbers that are despite being 1 out of every 3 people are using drugs, and they're women. 1 out of every 5 persons they use that are making part of the treatment is a girl or women. The inequalities, well, women are rejected many times from these residential programs, and this is because of the role that has been shown, the maternity role, that care role, the role of the family makes these families to avoid to seek this treatment. They're scared of losing the custody of their children. This is something that they're not considering in many of these treatment programs, and they're being restricted when, let's say, when a girl does not have access to treat themselves, to rehab, to make part of these social inclusion scenarios. They're affecting themselves and their health, their children's health in a huge way. Many of these women are particularly vulnerable to all the risk, especially those women who are deprived of the liberty and those women who find themselves in prostitution situations or sexual trade situations. And the majority of these women who use drugs that are injected are even more prone to men to acquire diseases like hepatitis C, HIV/AIDS, and in the world level, we can see that they surpass men in opioids consumptions, and this has greater consequences and they're fatal for the women's health. And which is the most common problem here that affects them at the moment of requesting help before this disorder because of the consumption of drugs. For on one hand, there's a great stigma. We can say this is the most complicated thing. The seeking of this treatment is persecuted like something that's an embarrassment. They feel bad, and they give them a role of care, of protection of their family, and once they see themselves in this situation, they fear the moment that they have to seek for help, and it's very difficult for them to approach us and to seek for help and to have a network of help or acceptance, or for the families to contribute and support them is a lot more difficult. The beginning of this in many of the cases is because of their partner becomes an obstacle as well to detain this treatment. It creates some resistance. Of course, maternity, the designing of all these programs, and the majority does not consider the care of their children, the maternity, the flexible hours that they must have, etc. But of course, these problems have been already spoken about throughout this event, and I believe that the most important thing here is to ask ourselves, what can we do? Because we already know this exists. And the key thing here is from those people who are heads of these programs and have the responsibilities to support these projects that involve the gender approach And what does this mean? Because it's very easy to say this, but how is this being materialized? And we consider that one of the key elements here is for us to have specific information that is relevant and of these people who are we pretending to help or include in these programs. This means to know all the roles, the expectations that are being attributed to these women and men in a determined context, and to be able to use this precise information and to know how to benefit these interventions and how we can center the differences and the particularities of these people. So there are 3 opportunities that we see here and that we could commit ourselves to on a daily basis of these projects. And one is to achieve to have the evidence for this diagnosis, to pick up this differentiating data by gender in a systematic way and in a permanent way, not only to have the data if it's a man or women, but also the interests of these women, the problems that they may have, the risk factors that these women may have, and for this information to be submitted to an analysis by gender to see what implications we could have in policies in the medium and long term. For this data to also inform us in case of treatments or in the topic of the linking or including of this preventions and why are they staying, why are not they staying, what problems are they having when the moment of access to benefit these from these programs, and in the case of the treatment to understand why are they having this relapse and what are the determinants for these people to have this relapse in consumption. The second aspect that we consider as an opportunity to incorporate this approach is to consider the occupation and participation, and to understand that these interventions of treatments and prevention must be linked on to how women administer their time, what is their burden, domestic work burden and paid work, so we can adapt them to these opportunities that we may have for them. And for these services to consider the overload or the burden, the practical needs, what we were speaking about, the care of their children if they're in charge of people, other type of people that they must care for, and especially specifically to give them those opportunities that once they're attending these services or these programs, there can be some care for their children, that the majority of these are under the charge of these women, and they can be articulated with other types of programs. The third opportunity is to provide integral or comprehensive support, speaking about these women who are pregnant or are breastfeeding, whether can receive comprehensive services where we can care for them. There is no stigmatization, discrimination, and especially a lot of support from their family and community in the social inclusion. To wrap this up, 3 things that we consider that are quite key is that we must guarantee those conditions so women can have access to their rights and to have equity of gender, and this will allow us to have a more fair and inclusive society and international day that is inviting us this year to have better knowledge for a better care. These events are very important because it will allow us to have some clear information, concrete information, so we're able to guide these policies that are key and proper for the needs of the women. And of course, I would like to tell you that we have commitment in the technical teams that are led by women to be able to go in depth in these gaps that we have permanently and that do not allow women to have the same access to all these services of prevention and treatment and social inclusion. So I believe that I will wrap my presentation up here. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm here to listen to my other colleagues.
All right. Thank you very much, Maria Mercedes. Thanks to you.
So we will continue at the end. I'll make a brief rapporteur of the most key issues of the interventions that we had of this panel, and we will continue now with the presentation by Carmen Meneses, whose presentation there is actually including the gender perspective in the intervention, the case of the victims of people trafficking. Right, good ones from Madrid. Welcome to all of them, and I'm very grateful for them to have there. Then we have the Congress that you've actually had there to be able to participate and to learn. Well, when one has to intervene and propose the experience and the knowledge in the last panel, you find that many of the things that you have already prepared for them have all been covered already. Someone there in the prior panel has mentioned many of the things that I had here. Of course, I'm going to perhaps be even more brief, but I want to have some ideas that I've actually had, that many of the things that I brought in the different panels that we have. 30 years ago, I used to work with women that consume heroin in the Madrid streets. 20 years, I did a doctoral thesis there, and those things that 30 years ago and 20 years ago, I tried to do from the experience and from research, and then we continue there. There's exactly the same, and that, sincerely, I find it embarrassing. And then we have in what have we progressed? I would ask myself, when I was hearing all of this, all guest speakers, I say, well, look, we've had greater participation, we've tried to socialize this, but this is not enough. All my prior contributions that we have made, they actually go along the same lines. Right, fine. This said, I hope that I would contribute some of the food for thought and knowledge that I have acquired in time with women who were users of psychoactive substances. But I wanted to propose what is this of gender perspective. And there are certain things that are fundamental. One, the analysis and the inspiration that leads you to intervention. In Spain in the 80s and 90s, we began to generate intervention programs, and they were analyzing the reality that was happening. This probably caught us by surprise, and with very few professionals in the 80s and 90s prepared for that. That made us that we made tons of mistakes, and the ones that paid the mistakes were women. I am going to propose certain issues there, I repeat, of the research as well as the intervention. And in principle, one of the things that Mercedes has done before that I reiterate is that we have studied the variables that have to do with the uses of psychoactive substances that enable us to have a gender analysis in a disaggregated areas. It seems something very obvious, but today there's studies, there are jobs, there are works and behaviors where you don't have that data, where it is very difficult to get to reach a series of conclusions that the adversities of the women that actually have had. Also to study the consumption of men and women in a differentiated way from a focus that is psychosocial. I remember that some 20 years ago, we were trying to see what was the pharmacodynamics of the psychoactive substances in women. There was very little information. The information that one would find, if it was a mother, and the information that would find, it was referred to the effects that they had, but the reality that women had to face, no. It is true that in this, something more we have progressed, and we know that there are certain psychoactive substances that harm women more than men. But we need, from that perspective, to work and to continue to work and to continue to research, but from the psychological standpoint and from the social standpoint, because men and women are not the same, as we have been saying throughout all these panels we're saying in the units and so on. So it's the same, whether it's in Madrid, Bogota, Paris, or Australia. If those inequities persist in industrialized countries as well as in developing countries. Also, there is another very important aspect and not to confuse and not to naturalize the matters that many times that women live because of social reasons that become naturalized. And let me explain this. Their maternity, the phases in the vital cycle that they may have, and that many times they actually self-medicate. So I'm thinking of all the processes of self-medications that are produced and generate a psychopharma dependency when the home is there with menstruation, that we have the postpartum depression and so on. When we analyze them, these are all social circumstances that there are vital stages of women that many times they're medicalized, and this we would have to have it theirs. It's also important to see is how do we have a construct, and panelists have had their masculinity and femininity in adolescents as well as in youngsters, and how these psychoactive substances are present there. We need interpretive frameworks that are different to the traditional ones that we have. Adolescents, they need frameworks. I mean, the active substances have some rebellious traditional roles that women and the grandparents actually had. And in that sense, we need to continue to progress in that. The relationships of inequities, of inferiority and subordination in both sexes, something that we have had to deal with, and something fundamental to be able to relate them. And also, we need to have more research to design intervention programs that actually help the needs of women, which are different, right? These are couples and violence and so on that are very present in them, and to design, and let's just say, interventions that are differentiated. I mean, women and men, they're going to have situations that require a joint intervention, but separate at there. And next to it, another of the aspects that is actually very important is the intersectionalities. I would like to put the case of in Madrid and in Spain, the Romanis presence, they have more than 500 years. And however, we do not have many times, and there's many of the developments and the social interventions that are being proposed. In the case of drugs, it's actually we're having there to have a cultural mediator or has helped not only to the women, but actually to the men, the Romanis, when we had a problem of addiction of psycho substances. So now I'm speaking now of the needs. I could speak of the age, or I could speak of the economic status and many other categories and variables that you put men and women in a different way within women and in a differentiated manner, okay? Well, going now more into the differentiated intervention and picking up more briefly and more quickly what other colleagues have said. Women need spaces in their treatment that are homey, that actually are welcoming without any stigmas. I was aware how many women and how many more professionals without one of theirs made some comment, or they had some looks that actually made that one of those women would never come back to the treatment center. On the other hand, these treatment centers, many a times, they actually have images of women that actually, that the social perception that women have is that women are far more difficult, far more complex and so on. And now they come here. There are very few, many a times in these treatment programs. And there is no differentiated care. And actually those barriers that effectively we have had with the responsibilities, with the timing and all these matters, makes that women do not come to the treatment centers. And if when they do arrive, they're stigmatized. Well, look, there I can remember the case of one of the women that we wanted her to go to a gynecologist because she was pregnant. As soon as they had the maid comes, that may never appear there until they had their baby. So these matters, these comments that one actually doubts for a many times. Now, know that they want to help, yes, but so many times they actually harm. And we actually need specific resources and a network, or work in a network, and there with a support network. Another fundamental aspect that continues to be very key is the issue of the the partner that consumes drugs, although it is true that women start their consumption because of their partner. For the case of Mina, in the case of heroin and cocaine, it's like that. It's not because of their couples. And yes, there comes there that both are hooked and they're dependent there, and the treatment there's not their time, not actually to actually cater this when both want to recover theirs and to leave their addiction. Also, we have to evacuate the treatment and the recuperation in these type of substances. These substances that are most used are the legal ones, the ones that are most tolerated, the ones that actually are more invisible. However, there are also illegal substances, and there's, as we have commented before, we have less resources or specific care. Unequivocally, a treatment with gender perspectives has to touch on the psychological and psychiatric ones, because the women, they have this feeling of guilt of breaking all these errors that I have been working there, and that's enormous. And because the self-esteem that so many times we speak about them, when I evidence that whenever women were having within the consumption in a very determined context of that, of the activities that were made in that context, these women, their self-esteem actually came there to the floor, because there were very few, because they did the same things that men did in the times. And when they actually left those contexts, the self-esteem would fall there, that feeling of guilt and the anxiety, depression, stress. All of these aspects have to be contemplated in the treatment programs. Also, of course, we have said, and I cannot stop saying, the violence, the in-house violence, the home violence. In many of the cases there, we have there with many of the women, as we evidence with heroin addicts and cocaine addicts and other type of substances, there has been underlying some type of sexual abuse that the program has to inspect it. I was also aware, and I gathered from many of these women that they had gone through a treatment and they had never said that they had been raped when they were 12 years old. And that, in many instances, actually helped as an excuse to fall again, because there was a trauma, there was a situation of psychic damage that had not been solved. So one has to find out how that violence, how that sexuality can be present, and how these psychoactive substances have a role of self-medication for them to overcome their trauma. Another of the important aspects in the intervention, and also it was mentioned this entire topic, that actually have done more, that have been working in the sexual intervention. Because I say this because depending on the women, some are actually forced to work sexually and others are going to live it as prostitution. The consumptions that actually produce are going to depend is how the women are located. In the case of sexual workers, they're going to use the use of psychoactive substances too, because in the relationship, in the sexual relationship, the customer is going to demand, and she's going to earn more money, and they're actually able to perform with those. But those women that we can talk that actually have been prostituted, that are there because they have not made any other decision, or they have been pressed by an array of factors that have led them there. Those women, sometimes they use psychoactive substances, but they end up having an important addiction. And in Spain, up until not long ago, women that had addictions and that were in issues of prostitution, it was difficult, like in gender violence, it was difficult for them to be admitted. We prefer to make specific programs, and in programs where they would integrate all these realities. And depending on the use of these psychoactive substances that women perform in terms of their sexual means, they actually should have hands for the treatment, for the recuperation as a function of their, or for the reduction of the risk. The use of the context of prostitution will be, and that is an evident one of the different types of substances. In concrete, the most used is alcohol and cocaine, and we have to work with women for these types of substances that they're going to use, because they're going to earn more money that actually harms them the least possible. And another important aspect is actually the differentiated care for substance consumption. because many times in this treatment program you work there at the identity as a mother, identity as a wife, identity as a care provider, but in spite of all those inclusions of women, those roles there, we're still women and we have our own reality as women, and that the treatment programs just overlook doing it. And from the gender perspective, it actually has to go to the essence, to what it means to be a woman for each one of them. And lastly, I am going to share a couple of strokes that are victims of people trafficking. Today is the International Day of Sexual Exploitation and Victims of Trafficking. In this collective group, the use of substances is present, and it's present in two ways, in two types of treatment. One piece of data to begin with, it would be that of 10 victims of trafficking, 5 are women and 2 are children, with a greater prevalence in developing countries, and where the causes of the victims of there are actually in poverty, inequity, violence, and everything where we have been doing precisely in the case of drugs, because there is an important interconnection. And for one thing that I want to overlook saying, because how the migration laws, or at least in Europe, force women to use not very safe networks for immigration. This is something that we need to think through, industrialized country. What can we do with the laws that we have that actually make it hermetic, and we do not allow that flow that, on the other hand, the Homo sapien has had since they have inhabited the planet. So as I was saying, to kind of close my presentation, there are two types of presence in these type of victims. First, you have the sexual people trafficking, and then the other is you have the criminal trafficking. In the criminal trafficking, the women that are victims of trafficking, they have been captured, tricked, or half tricked to be transported to transport psychoactive substances Europe, especially in Madrid. There are some studies in Spain where women who are sentenced for drug trafficking, like mules, they actually fulfill the requirements or the indicators that, in principle, are used in Europe and in Spain as victim of people trafficking. And it doesn't matter how many protocols and how many agreements, they're still in prison. When the penal code in Spain in the year 2015 incorporated the people trafficking there as one of the circumstances of exploitation that these networks are going to use. So we could say that we can find in Spain women who are paying a sentence for drug trafficking, and they were actually drafted through people trafficking. And then we have the women that are victims of people trafficking that come there, that actually come to Europe and in concrete to Spain. And there you have from the sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, or Eastern Europe, or the Asian women, especially Chinese. So these women come here, tricked, the majority of them. They don't know what they're going to do. Sometimes actually they're going to tell them they're going to do sexual work, but in many cases they have never offered them a job, and when they come here, they're going to find there with this circumstance. So these women are forced to consume psychoactive substance against their will, mainly alcohol and cocaine. And they're very associated with, as I commented before, they're very much associated with the sexual commerce in Spain because they earn a lot more. They're not going to earn it. It's actually their pimp is going to earn it. The customer is not aware in the majority of the cases that the one is providing them a sexual service is actually a victim of people trafficking, and she's being exploited. Because in the ethnographic jobs that I have done there, when I've asked the males, and if I were there, if I knew there, they would have a smile from ear to ear. So I mean, the lack of identification of the victims is one of the important elements that we have pending in Spain and in Europe. Also, in many occasions, the one who facilitates the consumption of psychoactive substances by the network so that they can bear the situations. The victims have to live there, and actually for them to perform so that they can actually perform 24 hours a day servicing customers so that they can improve for 14, 15 customers a day. And that, in the end of the day, is going to generate an addiction to the substance, to cocaine or any type of psychopharma, any opioid. So what they're going to do is going to have another tie, another link that they're going to have in another sort of scar that this traffic is going to be. Also, the victims are going to pursue the psychoactive ones, and I have perceived them in their interviews, and the work that I have done in the research with them is self-medication. The process that many times they have lived in is horrible, and when a victim of people trafficking, when we rescue them in the first months, the trauma is so big, and the side effects are so big. There's the self-medications, the use of psychoactive substances without prescription are going to have a role of sort of soothe all the trauma that they have lived. Although they can be there in psychosocial support, they need to soothe all the hurt that they have there. So in principle, I'm going to finish my intervention reminding you firstly that the victims of people trafficking, just as women that consume psychoactive substances, are not very visible. They require support and specific programs with specific support, and they need to articulate the interventions that are more in accordance with their needs and with their recuperations. And they're far more vulnerable, these types of victims, the victims of trafficking, to being re-victimized in many occasions. That actually does it in a greater level in the case of other women that are users of substances. Without further ado, I'd like to say thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure. Carmen, thank you very much for your valuable intervention.
This perspective has been very interesting, quite painful, quite harsh. What you have shared with us on the treatment for women, or the trafficking for women. I'm going to give the space to Berenice Dominguez. Her presentation is named Spite Aratna, a perspective situated in women who have survived gender abuse and consumption abuse as well. Thank you very much for the invitation. I am going to give the way to my presentation.
¿Ahí se ve?
Can you see it?
Sí, perfectamente. Adelante.
Vale, sí, perfecto. Vale, el Spite Aratna
The
es un
Spite Aratna is a resource that was created in 2013 to give response to all the needs that were detected in the intersection of the problem of gender violence and the abuse of substances. This service is residential for cis women and trans-non-binary ones who have a problem with drugs and who has lived or are living through gender violence, and which they can assist with their children if they have one. What we basically pretend to do in the Spite Aratna is to give them a safe space, a secure space for their children, and to facilitate the awareness and because of the change, and provide all the necessary tools and accompany them in the recovery stage, the social one and education one, from all the women who have been attended in a specific way in this double problematic, to provide all the things that they need for these women and teenagers and kids, and specific needs for their recovery. We can work with the network and also work with all the perspective of gender and the attention that is centered towards the person. So what is the Spite Aratna? I would like to play a video. I am going to
¿Se ve bien el video?
Can you see the video correctly?
Yo no veo video, ¿no?
I cannot see a video. No, to share the video, you must stop sharing the screen, and then you can choose the video or select the video and also share the sound of the video via Zoom. All right, so I am going to share the sound, the screen and the sound, please. Yes, effectively.
¿Sí? ¿Se escucha?
There, can you hear me? Can you hear the video?
No, lo estamos viendo.
No, ma'am. We're watching the video, but we cannot hear it. You must share your sound.
¿Escuché el video?
No, aún no.
Can you hear the video? No, not yet.
Vuelvo otra vez. Ahí lo pueden escuchar y lo pueden ver.
Hear it and watch
Sí,
it?
efectivamente.
Yes, ma'am.
Gracias.
Miedo.
Fear,
Soledad.
loneliness,
Culpa.
guilt,
Estereotipos.
stereotypes,
Sortint del laberint.
leaving the puzzle or the maze,
Obrir el lloc de tancar.
opening up a place that is closed. Voices of the survivors.
La autoestima se ve minada.
Self-esteem. Sorry, I cannot hear her. Can I hear the video correctly to interpret? It's mentally is a total lack of balance. I'm sorry, I cannot hear her. So there comes the moment when
¿Ya lo escuchas mejor? Sí. Sí, no, pero ya.
I had thought of getting rid of this fear, given that I was being minimized as a person. I have been able to ask myself if I did right before ignoring the fact that these violent situations were taking me to consume. I had a violence since a very early stage of my life, since I was 14, and a lot of violence in my infance, my childhood. We use the way of alcohol and of those other roads as something that will relieve us to get rid of the truth of all this physical violence that we have lived. Amongst these buckles, there's violence. I heard of this resource. And it was like, you're telling me something that, and there's a place like this that doesn't care if I'm trans. And I said to myself, I must try it. When I couldn't support myself anymore, it brought me here to this process. Now I am trying to change, to have a different life, to be able to do something, accomplish something, because I was never able to accomplish anything. I was always leaving things halfway done. I lost my house, I lost my children, because I didn't want to live the violence that I was going through. And in this manner, all that pain, that's irreparable. So I reflected right away, and I said, how many more things must I lose? I want to try it, I want to learn how it feels to live in another way.
Bien, ¿ahí me escuchan otra vez?
Okay, can you hear me again?
Sí, Berenice, solo una
Yes,
recomendación que nos
Berenice,
damos.
I would like to
3-4
tell you that we only have 3-4 minutes for your intervention, so
Lo tengas en cuenta.
okay, perfect,
Gracias.
so you can consider this. Thank you.
Ya han dado como muchos
All right.
datos todas las
We
ponentes
have given a lot
anteriores.
of information in the
Ay,
prior
pero es en el
presentations throughout the day, so
mujeres que
despite
tenemos
the
hemos
women that we
identificado que el
have
80% de
picked
estas
up, we had identified 80% of these women have suffered all types of
identifican haber
mistreatments,
vivido
and 80% of them have lived sexual abuse. 53% of these have had violence during their childhood, and 40% sexual violence through their childhood. So words of these women, which is very important for us to consider. I have been treating this cocaine topic about 15 years now, but I had never spoken about abuse. Once I went to the doctor, I was marked. I went to the doctor's visits and he never asked me anything. We reached an agreement for the depressions I have had and all the violences I've gone through. I have didn't go to the attention center visits. I have a small child, and this is not a place for me to visit with my child. I was high when this happened. Who was going to believe me? I was fear because I do not have any documents. I never identified these violences that I had lived through, because when I would consume drugs, I would also become violent.
El España Diana trabajamos con
In Spider-Man, we work with gender perspectives because
integramos
we integrate
una mirada
a view,
en las condiciones de
a
admisión al
perspective
servicio
in
de
the aspects of all these aspects that need help because of something that has to do with gender. We created this
y violencias machistas en base
chauvinist violence based on the
pero las necesidades específicas del
specific
género.
needs of the gender.
Esta mirada es clave en el tratamiento
This
de drogodependencias y
perspective is
violencia.
drug dependence and violence. Now that we understand the gender as a symbolic thing that are created by the masculine, and this has been working. Excuse me, she's reading. I cannot follow her.
Voy a
And
sostenerla.
it's
La
contributing
desigualdad
to the
implica
maintenance the
violencia.
inequality, implies violence. The mistreatment of gender creates damage or harms people.
La perspectiva feminista
The
interseccional
feminist perspective that's intersectional and
es
quite
un marco analítico, una mirada al
is an
mundo,
analytical
una forma de
framework or perspective of the world to view the real truth in
y
gender and
condicionantes
other
sociales.
social conditionings.
Esta perspectiva de género también nos
This gender
permite
perspective also allows us to include perspectives of the law and integrates women so they can strengthen their view, and its intention is integrated for people, the limits and the linkings, the positioning, subjective one, and excuse me, she's reading, I cannot follow her. This paradigma implies 24-hour intervention with this gender perspective. The practice
empieza a ver a las mujeres como
begins to see
supervivientes
women as survivors
de su propia
and
vida.
stars of their own life, protagonists of their own life, and it's good to consider that throughout this treatment, once they're, because the fact of being a woman people who are ordinary in this determined
traducen
historical
intervenciones
moments.
concretas que van desde la propia
These
concepción
interventions
de
are
la
interpreted that goes to the conception of what Spider Dogma had to do with the smallest things of the daily basis
hacemos
life. This
y cómo lo
view will
hacemos.
determine
El
how we do
modelo
things, and
funcional nos
this
permite ver cómo la
bidirectional
violencia de
model
género
allows
y
us
el
to
uso de
see how this gender
sustancias,
violence and the use of substances,
de alguna manera,
one way
no
or
se habla
another,
de
does not speak
causalidad
about
de una
the sexuality, but
de
about
estas
increased
vulnerabilidades.
spiral of this.
Tener en cuenta el cuerpo para
So we
nosotras es muy
consider
importante.
our body for us is very important.
Cuestionamos, nos hacemos
We
preguntas,
inquire
observamos
ourselves, we ask questions, we see the
cuando estas dos
interrelationships in
coexisten.
one problem and another one, these both coexist,
Relaciones
and we do not speak about causal relationships that bring this abuse or substance. They say, I do not have two houses, I have one for violence and one
y está todo
for
mezclado.
consumption. I just have one box and everything is mixed. We have some exercises where they can propose their life story, and
Como el consumo,
with
¿no?
violence
Nos
and
muestran a veces
consumption, sometimes they show it and sometimes they create puzzles where everything begins to face and two parallel paths, one path
ahí nos
itself or
permite
one road by itself, and this is what allows us to accompany them so they can identify these experiences where there is no violence, abuse, or consumption, where there only has been violence or drug consumption, or where they're intersecting themselves with violence and the consumption of drugs. These lines for these women tells us that the violence and consumptions normally are there since their childhood in their family, and there's things in the sexual abuse in infant life and survival. They have sex for survival. They begin to identify the use of drugs with violence, and the violence and consumptions go hand by hand in their story. They have tried to do things to change this, and we have tried to help them several times. These points of abusive consumption are found with loneliness, depression, anxiety, or craving, and these treatments that we have for them is the abandonment of two pillars of their life, the substances and their partner. These phrases that have been repeated again as the way used to mistreatment, I wonder if I was important for them. They've done it from, I miss them, I miss those hands that used to hurt me, but I'm a faithful partner. Now in these boxes we have found cycles, consumption, identity, self-esteem, sexuality, maternity, identity, stigma, racism, and other discriminations.
Vergüenza y una desproblematización de la rabia.
And
Tratamos de atender todas estas
we are
áreas,
trying
¿no?
to tackle all these areas, many prismas, many different ways. The work with our body is very important for us to identify myths on the cycle of this violence and the cycle of consumption, the importance of relationships, the work with sexuality, and all the identifications that they have had, or identities that they had had in their identity, and the role that the poverty plays in their life.
Las distintas
We
dificultades
already
que
have
las
spoken about the
mujeres
different difficulties that these women who consume drugs have a type of problem addiction. This presents itself in their life as the beginning of the violence in their childhood. We saw that 80% of this incidence of gender violence is 3 times larger than the general population. These risk factors of relapse and consumption, this work with different tools allows us to be able to accompany them so they can identify these loneliness feelings, these depressive moments, these guilt moments, and the increase of weight, the emergency of feelings and traumatic feelings that they had lived through prior. And sorry, she's reading, cannot follow her. And sometimes the family of consumers and the assistance practices that allows us to recover. And collective, secure ways we return the trust, and with their maternity, they just the attention and the companionship that's centered in the person, trying to accompany them in the recovery of their life project. And we also try to address their personal characteristics and all those constructs that and all the environmental patterns as challenges that we are expecting. We have identified the reconstruction of the own stereotypes and gender prejudice, and the services that are there, the facilitate access to trans people in this incidents, try to have autonomy and useful things for women in this incidents are 2 problems. At the same time, we consider that we're lacking a lot of services for these incidences for these women when they require it, work that is required
anti-asistencialismo dirigido a la autorganización de las mujeres para el empoderamiento económico y la de vivienda y la participación de las mujeres
participation of the women and the design and creation and construction of other projects and the resources for the intervention. This is a blog that we did with this confinement, and
si gustan visitarlos.
We will leave you our links, so if you like to visit us, thank you very much.
Berenice, lamento que
Thank you
hayas
very
tenido
much, Berenice. I'm sorry that you had to go so quick. You had to run so much in this moment.
había mucho contenido, claro.
Of course, I know you had a lot of content, so I know you had to read quickly through it. Thank you very much for the effort, so we wouldn't stay behind since we've been so wise with time. Thank you very much. So I'm going to do a type of intervention that is not easy when the content of the presentations are so when the content of these presentations are so long and heavy and full of such valuable things. So we're going to start with Maria Mercedes, who
offered us kind of the framework of the mandates by the UN that they usually are signed by a diversity of countries, and they actually mark, if you want, the public policy when they're defined like that, and then you have the framework there as part of this consensus, and then you have a gender focus, and then we have, and then you have their countries, and we actually do this of the, and then we have some standards, and then we have there based on the evidence whose goal is, and then it's not only to reduce the age, or excuse me, to increase the age of when people actually consume this, but it actually goes over and beyond that when they want to, let's say, contribute to this end goal of this healthy development of the younger ones, and that bet for equity and so on and opportunities, which is a bet that is far more broad to try to transcend the goals, the conventional goals of the prevention as we know them, or we have known it in the last decades. It actually frames their presentation of their sustainable development goals, where they actually propose a healthy life to promote well-being and the gender equality as a topic that is absolutely transversal to all the objectives, the strategies of equality and 2018 for women. There has been the work for the last years as of 2018 for the office, and of course we are beginning to kind of see the reference framework of many of the problems that have been identified in the different presentations throughout these 3 days, that they have to do with the gender inequity that of course affects women by increasing their own risks of entering in a consumption pattern, and of course, and have a problematic use with the substances. The limitation with the services with a gender perspective that I think the other two colleagues of our panel also enunciated it like that, and they published it like that. The seeking of treatment as of the fear of losing the custody of their child, the high risk in health that women have to live through, the high rates of being deprived of liberty, and then being involved in prostitution and sexual work. And then we have making known the women that inject drugs that are far more prone to infectious disease that are transmitted via blood, especially in the consumption of opioids, with this enormous risk that actually what it involves because of overdoses. Basically, they close their presentation by giving us like 3 opportunities that they have identified in the UN office, UNODC, to accompany the countries in the development of policies and strategies. And one of them is the generation of evidence, that I think we all coincide that there's very little evidence, and this evidence many a times is just not enough, or has not been enough today, with the importance of being able to have a gender analysis and many data that actually tell us really of the adherence and the barriers for these adherence for the treatment that wears at the rest of the interventions of all this, to keep this in mind, the issues of occupation, and then so that you enable them or you allow the active participation of women in their actions, and to provide an integral case in the cases of women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, and then that you actually have some resources that enable women to act their role of caregivers, and their reality and their circumstances demand it. These aspects that Maria Mercedes mentioned and so on, they were actually went in depth by our two guest speakers, both by Carmen as well as with Berenice. Carmen basically calls to our attention that it is a scolding also that is very pertinent of what we have to do, that for more than 3 decades we have been talking about the same problem and the needs and so on, but we do not achieve any progress per se, just more light on the problem, because inequities persists, the problems persists that are associated and associated to the consumption of substances in women that derived of all those substances. And we kind of actually land a bit of what it implies or means, this gender perspective in this, and then she also proposes the need of opening the venues of creation of evidence, the definition of variables that are disaggregated by gender, that enables us to allows us to stop having those blind spots in respect of what they tell us of the research and the evidence in terms of consumption among women. And also they propose the need to approach in a differentiated way in the psychosocial content that enables us to have depth and in the particular needs and specific needs of women. This perspective, psychological and social, is something that she emphasized quite a bit, and in the need of not confusing and naturalizing the roles of women, and to be able to distance yourself from those traditional roles, to begin to integrate in all of our interventions and strategies and policies the frameworks that are innovative, that really allow us to recognize what is the role that today the consumptions of the different types of consumption have in the life of women, that can be a bit different from the stereotypes, and evidently they mean a breaking from the status quo and with the imaginaries that one has as to what a woman has to be in our society today. These frameworks of intervention must be adjusted to these realities and these needs of women. And they actually speak of the intersection of this as a fundamental framework of analysis and interpretation of all this evidence and all this information to which we are approaching. And so once we really start to go in depth in what this differential reality is. So she was mentioning something that actually allows us really to have the presentation of Berenice, which actually implies to be differentiating in these venues, that you have to service women, they have to be really warm, without stigma, without judgment. And obviously they actually reduce the access barriers that are very typical. And then she finishes proposing like all the aspects of her research in the phenomena of people trafficking, women who are victims of the trafficking, and they're obviously with some stories that are very painful and very in the sense that it is precisely the inequity and violence and so on, and the very migratory laws and the lack of opportunity that actually forces women to be involved in a phenomenon of this such complex nature, that obviously this sexual treatment is a crime, and that obviously in all this framework of sexual trade is actually very very crossed by violence. What there's with this trade, with which we come back to retake something that we spoke in the previous panel, that has to do with this relationship with women, with the substance in a sort of luck of finding an escape path with the drugs to all the hardships that they had to live, and even before they begin to consume the substance, and how those substances actually begin to have like a very important role. Then passing on now to what Berenice is proposing, and there we have a resource that is really very interesting about the Esparri Atlas strategy. I don't know if it's a strategy, a program, and so on. I don't know if I'm being accurate, but basically it is a service that actually has integrated there the focus of the gender diversity and gender, and they propose this metaphor of a labyrinth that I find it to be very powerful, because in effect is that how do women manage to escape a labyrinth of violence, of stereotypes, of guilt, of stigma that actually makes them go deeper in the risks and the damages, the harm, and how they become far more chronic if you don't manage to achieve to break these cycles, these loops of violence. And they were saying in the testimony of the video in a very, very clear way, or they were showing it there as a very clear need. Well, they were proposing a bit of the gender ones as a symbolic ones that actually contributes one way to actually back all this equality that actually have them there is in this suffering and in this life trajectories that are so painful. And they're actually proposing also how to integrate this feminist perspective intersectional in each one of these interventions that we require. I think that all of these in a transversal way remind us that somehow women that use substances and the ones that develop a problematic use with the substances get to them in a very fractured way. In other words, they arrive there, they're already fractured inside whenever they begin to use this. And of course, this actually just makes the situation even worse of suffering, of trauma, of complex trauma. And this obviously becomes like a sort of array of circles that viciously feed one another in an unhealthy spiral. And then here we have a narrative where drugs really actually pass through a second stage, and really what we manage to do is to focus ourselves on women as a center of the policies and the strategies. And in this, Berenice obviously she closes her intervention speaking about the importance of progressing towards the reduction of harm with a gender focus, which actually implies the processes of women, the participation and the agency of women for their own change and well-being in their life trajectories. I am going to then share with you certain questions that came through the chat. And this is for Maria Mercedes, and it says, how can we push from UNODC the adoption of prevention and treatment strategy with gender perspective in the member states?
Bueno, pues realmente es más que una necesidad, es una obligación que tenemos. Creo que esto va más allá de contar cuántas mujeres acceden a los programas, ya lo vimos. Creo que parte, como lo decíamos, de tener una información muy clara que sale de los estudios, pero que también sale de las caracterizaciones, de los análisis de los factores de riesgo y de protección, y a partir de ahí incorporar las estrategias y el enfoque de género en los programas. Nosotros hemos tenido varias experiencias.
Several experiences, in particular in the province of Cauca. We have been working with the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace, and we developed some special programs for women that are leaders, and we found that the majority of these women have, how to say it, they manage to achieve more follow-up of the people than the very men. They have a very strong leadership and very transforming leadership and an enormous capacity to get to many people. So I think that to strengthen the leadership, to strengthen the competencies, the skills, to actually make prevention, to get to the boys and the girls and so on. I think that women is a transversal agent in these communities. This is kind of like our bet, that we have that balance in the programs, and also there to have the identification of indicators that allow them to adapt to the contexts, and that the programs cater to the specificities of women. This is an effort that is not easy, no, but I think that ever more we have more awareness of that towards the outside and in the team, which is what the most important thing, because if you don't do an internal awareness there, you're not going to be able to see it on the outside. Right, yes. To make visible what up to date has been invisible. What a change, yes. Great, there's another question for Carmen. Which players are strategic to progress in implementing actions to progress in servicing women? Which players are strategic to progress in the implementation of actions in caring for women? Well, we're going to see, I don't know if, well, actually what they are actually did, but I understand that strategic actors means the ones who are designing the policies and the intervention programs. I mean, the professionals that are actually executing it. And also the diversity and the circumstances that women live and the way they have to adapt. I mean, women are not homogeneous, they are very heterogeneous with many realities. So let's just say that our politicians, our technicians, the ones that design the programs, they have to let's say, keep in mind that the face of diversity. Now, of course, you have men there. When we speak of gender, we speak of both things. We're focusing mostly on women. And so there we have there that it seems to me that these are the ones in the case of the use of substances or drugs. If we look at a whole series of problems that are associated, the issue of violence is actually has come out in this entire session. It's something that the programs that work with violence have to contemplate the programs of the women that actually use drugs. In Spain, a person that had a victim it was never a service in this one, and this actually has meant a review and important changes with which I don't know if I actually have answered there of the question what you want, but that's I understand that it would be along those lines. That's very fine. And yes, there were a couple of things that I wanted to highlight of your presentation, Carmen, that you retake here. And I think that this is very, very powerful and very important to highlight that you were mentioning something about it, focusing on the type of substances that are used in a very differentiated way because of the contents and the circumstances of uses and the identity as a woman in the midst of that great diversity that is to be a woman, and to be able to make it visible and to integrate and to materialize in the different interventions. I think that is fundamental. Right, so one last question for Berenice. And this is how to tackle the consumption in women that are homeless. I don't know if we have there. I think that's it. How to tackle this, so these women that are homeless, they're street, they live in the streets. Well, precisely that is what one of the suggestions or one of the challenges that we see is it is that need for the resources of reducing the risk and the harm, because we consider that many of these women depend on the situations in which they are not always see that they're capable to actually have access to a process that actually seeks abstinence. So I think that it's important to start from a sensitivity of a relationship from their environment where they are. It's really true that there are many people that do want to come in and they do want to do a process and they want to make many changes, and then they find all these array of difficulties that are typical of a process. But it is also true that many women do not want or do not find themselves in a time to leave the street. So to work from those places, we have to work there, to be able to accompany there, so to be able to offer instances and to be able to offer really what they truly need. Places where it's warm, where there's coffee, where you can do some intervention that allows them to get tied there and to be able to have some other shares with other women. Sometimes I feel that many of the women that are on the streets are actually too isolated and to relate with other women. It's actually, if you do it from some places where the portability is not big there, so the contributions is not big, so to be able to reduce the risks and the harms and to keep them in mind, to keep them at the center in the processes of construct of these resources. What is really that they need? What do they say? They are already in the middle, and what do they live? And that you keep that in mind, their voice. Yes, to give them voice. That's very important, right? A very good closing. Thank you very much, Maria Mercedes. Thank you very much for having participated in this last panel. And that's important for us, and I would like to, today we have passed to the closing. I don't know, I think that is Mr. Hernando Londoño, the director of the substitution of crops of the renewal of the territory, who will give his last words. So with that, I would like to close this, and thank you very much. Thank you very much to all. Right, so thank you very much to all this. This is a very warm greeting to all of you, and to all of you that actually have accompanied this very important workshop, that I find it fundamental to strengthen the work that we have been doing from the different institutions in recognizing that today, with the increase of women and of the relationship with women and drug trafficking and drugs that worry the entire society, actually that leads and gives us and try to find truly alternatives and solutions, so that the policies are really geared towards servicing with a special emphasis women in this very grave problem that our society has to face, which is the problems of drugs and illicit crops. In general terms, I really want to add on to this and to let you all know that the policy of peace with legality and its implementation, that they are a result of the commitment of this government to tackle and to service that many years ago we should have faced by the state and by the Colombian government in respect of the difficulties and all the gaps that are generated in the territories. In the same way, that we need to recognize that peace is built in time. That's why we implement these commitments of the peace agreement, and they should help us to overcome in this government and these 2 or 3 more governments after, so that we have a long-term commitment that actually provides truly solutions in the territories, and that enable that the drug problem actually is being controlled and actually finishes, and it actually is crushed with greater vigor year after year. Also, we need to recognize that this is an irreversible process, and that we must all understand that only the implementation of these programs with a territorial focus through the next governments are we going to find the solutions to the great difficulties that our society has to face. Likewise, the closing of gaps, the strengthening of equality of women and gender in the institutions and the policies should be a task that we should actually tackle together. We, from the division of crop substitution that actually are service of women and gender, we have assumed a true commitment, an effective commitment, so that all the policies of willingness substitution in the national territory have clearly defined their gender focus of women and gender, and that we are providing true opportunities to women so that they may actually go back to legality and forget the illicit crops in a sustainable way in time. It is important also to recognize that in the peace policy with legality, the commitment of the President Duque and the Counseling for Stabilization and Consolidation has maintained permanently the work in women and gender, and we are all convinced that continuing with this effort that we're making and with the guidelines that are being traced from this government and from the counseling, we are actually going to have results that are quickly, that enable us to show that the care of women and gender is, you have great part of the solution of drugs and illicit crops. It is important to recognize really that 34% of women of cocoa planters and crops are tied to this program are women, and therefore the differential focus and the care to women actually can be delivered to us quickly some answers to the difficulties that women have to face in the most remote areas of Colombia. And with the greatest difficulty, I want to congratulate the UNODC, the Ministry of Justice and of Law, and all the international delegations and multinational ones that have been tied to this event. And I want to thank really that these spaces of information exchange and experiences are the best way to strengthen our institutional teams that are prepared or are preparing for the new challenges that we have to face in the gender focuses in the fight against drugs. I would like to hand over therefore the mic to my colleague from the UN, Miguel Serrano, so that he closes the event, and to thank you there for this minute that you have given that enables there, and they have allowed us, and really to thank that actually we have these spaces here and exchange there and experiences, and that strengthen us all. Thank you very much and good afternoon. Right, so thank you very much to Hernando, the comments that he has made. For us, it is a great fortune to close this venue, knowing that we have a very extended participation in many ones in many countries that actually they were able to share the information, the knowledge of all the people that were participating here. Firstly, I want to give thanks to all the guest speakers, to all the people that shared their knowledge, to the people that actually provide support with the moderation, their person of great knowledge that facilitated this debate, discussion, and that we're able to give us a very fortunate synthesis of the progress in the discussions. I would like, before we have the final closing, I would like to make a brief mention of some people that are invisible as always in these type of meetings. There are some that the ones actually come out on TV, but many people are behind everything, making an enormous effort, trying to make that this to work really. In a way, I want to thank enormously the team of the work areas of territorial studies of CIMSI, to the team that in the Ministry of Justice and of Law that collaborated broadly in the preparation and the discussion of the content, the people that actually participated, and also, of course, to the technical team that was in charge of doing the transmission and the translation. For them, for all of them, thank you very much. It's been very successful, this work. In respect of this meeting, more than conclusions, I think that it's a bit to propose conclusions, generic conclusions, after having observed the diversity of proposals about the different realms of which we have actually covered. I would say that firstly, it has been fulfilled the purpose of presenting to the different people that were able to participate a broad panorama of those interactions, of the presence and of the role of women in the drug trafficking chain from an integral perspective. In other words, considering the different links in the drug trafficking chain. That was our first purpose, and well, we hope, we believe that we have achieved it, and we believe that we have done so in a satisfactory way in that sense. In the second place, there are certain elements specific that definitively are connecting the universe of production, the universe of trafficking, and the universe of consumption, and that they have to do with three main factors. First, the conditions of marginality, social and economic one, that directly are linking women, whether in the realm of production as well as in the consumption. Secondly, the violences, the gender violence with their multiple facades, their multiple expressions that also are clearly observing there as a factor that is a driver, a generalized driving factor of the participation of women in these problems. And thirdly, the need that we have of actually going in depth into the realm of research in the three aspects. We find there that, and it was a marvelous finding, a marvelous meeting for us. We found that there was a great amount of work that was very valuable that are showing us that the topic is progressing, is evolving, not only in Colombia, in Latin America and in general, but also in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. And we think that unequivocally that is a positive step, the progress, and that we actually encourage us to continue with the work that we're doing. But at the same time, we find that in spite of all this progress, there's still a great amount of elements that must be analyzed in greater depth, because we need to find functional indicators, appropriate indexes, and this is a task that we think has been clearly shown by the different presentations of the women and men who have been participating in this meeting, in this event. And in this sense, we hope to share not only the what at this time we have as a result of this meeting at the level of memoirs that we will share with the presentations of the all different guest speakers for all the people that are registered, that they filled out their data and they gave us their email so that we can send them there. But also we expect also to be able to exploit and to tie even further some of the people that we observe are working in coinciding lines with what is being developed in the joint team of work between the Ministry of Justice and Law and the UNODC, and that will be very desirable also to be able to integrate the academic activities, both of Colombia as well as the different countries that have participated. And also we expect that this will contribute gradually to continue to generate the evidence, this substantive evidence that enables us to improve the interventions and to make them more adequate in respect of the problems of women. I would like to thank finally to the Ministry of Justice and of Law for the possibility that they have given us to be able to develop an initiative that we were speaking with for what, some 3 years back, and that to date had not been possible to make it finish, and we're thankful very much your participation. We hope that you have a very good evening, and thank you very much to all the people that have been with us. Thank you very much. Bye.